Dungeon 42. By S. Jackson. Chapter 101. Interlude. When my call with Myra and Hecha ended, I flopped down on my couch. The new one in the lounge of the Palace of Shadows. I was still getting used to the name, accustomed to thinking of everything as the Chamber of Machinations. That it was at best half-finished did not help. Well, I think that went, I said gingerly. I'd fucked up by not admitting I was the dungeon master. I'd just been too surprised by the question of if I worked for myself. Then another question had been asked, and it got progressively more awkward to backtrack. Sitting on the second couch, Dawn was fussing over a project. A recent development and one born of her needing to hide it for some reason. She looked rather majestic in the tunic and pants set she'd recently acquired. It was marigold orange with a gold line work pattern of skulls I'd added at her request. Cheerfully macabre. You could lie if you want to, Dawn pointed out. I had about 10% of her attention as she worked on a leather vambrace. She'd been one of the many who didn't take up a craft initially, but she'd found an interest recently. I think that'll just cause more problems in the long run, I said and sighed. Dawn nodded, not the least bit invested. What is that for exactly? I asked. It wasn't like I knew much about leather working, but this was her fourth try. That suggested it was a bit more important than a simple practice piece. Oh, Icarus asked me to marry him, Dawn replied. That's an I hold up. I said. I went from sitting to functionally bouncing upright. Mistress? Dawn asked nervously. Congratulations. I said, positively giddy. Thank you. Dawn replied. I did my best to rein in my enthusiasm, which was probably more intimidating than reassuring in appearance. I was a coiling mess of excitement. Let me know if you need anything. I'm happy to set up a special venue or whatnot, I offered. Venue for what? Dawn asked. Wedding? Or is that not your kind of thing? I asked. It was easy to forget I knew jack shit about the various customs the skeletons embraced. Oh. The goddess I serve, Laminal, does have a ritual, but I haven't talked with Icarus about that. I supposed I thought we'd just exchange tokens of troth, and that would be it, Dawn explained. Ooh, no pressure. You can do what you want, I said, backpedaling hard. Dawn studied me with her golden eyes for a few moments, her newly expressive face scrunched up with a kind of curious annoyance. Mistress, what would they do where you're from? Dawn asked me. There was a lot of variation, but usually some smaller parties for the family or friends, then the ceremony, followed by a larger party, I offered. I expected something stranger than that, Dawn said and chuckled. I feel like that was a jab, I pouted. It was me being honest. You always shy away from talking about things like that, so I thought you were worried because they were strange, Dawn. I talk about my old world a fair amount, I countered. Usually, when it came up due to contrast or something like that. I wasn't really into just sitting around and listing random facts about it. Yes, but not, as friends would, I suppose. You're always very careful. Tense even at times, Dawn explained. I hadn't noticed, I replied lamely. That got me a snort in reply. Well, see if you do now and think about why. I rather like it when you talk to me normally. Stiffness doesn't suit you, Dawn said, gesturing with a leather knife. She returned to her task only to curse and throw the half-finished leather working aside. Some minor flaw had apparently ruined it. You know, I can reset your skills if you'd like to be better at that. I didn't do it originally because you weren't interested at the time, I offered. It was an issue with a lot of the skeletons. They hadn't known what they wanted to do, so I'd been wary of changing their skills. Most did have at least a few ranks of crafting, after all. Forcing them to have a higher level or take a new one hadn't seemed right. Perhaps. I'd prefer to make tapestries, but my mother never had time to teach me, Dawn said, digging her fingers into her hair. According to her, she couldn't feel it but experienced resistance. It had taken a while to sort out that the ability to feel resulted from the illusion. Thus it didn't affect the person wearing it the same way as someone else touching it. Aaron was still having a field day sorting out the spell involved. I can check and see if that's an option, I offered. Of course, my abilities let me get around needing that kind of skill when I wanted to make something from cloth. Still, that didn't mean no one else could choose to enjoy the craft. I was more results-oriented but could see the appeal of the process. It wouldn't be useful like Henry's art, Dawn said glumly. I don't recall saying your hobbies needed to be. Also, bullshit, tapestries are cool, I countered. I hadn't dug into the skill section too deeply since there had been few takers on the point. Let's reset your skills and see if you like something new, I offered. I also made a quick image capture of Dawn's current setup if we needed a reference later. Moving around a few things she didn't need or care about was one thing. Her abilities ending up a mess because of my negligence was another. Very well, Dawn agreed. She looked like she was trying to hide a touch of excitement. Once I okayed the reset, a panel appeared in front of Dawn. So, your max skill rank right now is 8, your level plus 3. Some skills have caps and won't exceed a certain number, usually 6. I have no idea why, I offered. Dawn was already poking at the arrows curiously. The ones like craft with an arrow next to them have a nested menu. Touch it, and more options appear, I explained. Dawn dutifully tested it out, and a skill drop-down appeared. Oh, shit, I said in a blatant understatement. The nested list was an index, not simply skill names. Each one was a list of 1 to 4 letters in length. Is something wrong? Dawn asked, curious rather than alarmed. No, I'm just feeling a bit overwhelmed and mildly disappointed in myself, I explained. Dawn took that reply in stride and started examining the list. She found the skill she was looking for as a subcategory of weaving. Interestingly, she took ranks in weaving and got the option to take a specialization feat to grant her access to the associated skills for that one. I was way too curious to bother with the cost and paid for her to get a level increase to gain the needed crafting feat. I had blown mana on significantly less productive endeavors and had no problem justifying this one. So, you'll have to help me figure out what you need to get going, but then you should be good, I offered cheerfully. Dawn looked at her hands curiously, her expression one I didn't know how to read. Everything okay? I asked. What Icarus said before. Women like me are given to serve Laminal. Our hair contains the colors of the moons, so we were considered her servants, Dawn said, touching hers. My mother tried to keep me, shaved my head, so I had memories of her, unlike the others. I don't know what happened to her once I was taken. The sisters were kind to me, but I always wondered about that, Dawn added. Well, I hope it was good things, I said honestly. That situation sounded fucked up to me, but Dawn didn't look like she wanted me to rant about injustice. This was a private hurt she was choosing to share, and I would respect how she handled it. You're a strange one, mistress, Dawn said and laughed. I gave her a shoulder pat, not knowing how to read her mood at this point. I left Dawn to her introspect while I looked up Laminal. Dawn had mentioned the goddess before, but I hadn't talked with her about it at the time. I'd been thoroughly distracted and pretty much forgot about it. Not cool on my part, but things had been a bit hectic. Laminal, CN. Goddess of night, stars, secrets, and rebirth. Mate of Dalshan but the bride of none. Laminal was born of the void that once filled the place where the sky came to be. Many sought her among the chaotic old gods because of her secrets which they believed held immense power. The sun god rather schemed to capture her by slaying her mate Dalshan and hiding his body in the cosmic void. He set the great raven of darkness to guard Dalshan's remains to prevent Laminal from recovering him to force her to yield. Laminal tricked the great raven and slew it, fashioning a cloak from its feathers that hid her from Rather's gaze. While she could not restore Dalshan to his former state, she could resurrect him as a triple god. He became the three moons of blood, gold, and bone. Together they would give birth to the stars. Rother's relentless pursuit of them gave rise to the cycle of night and day. Well, she sounded utterly metal. It looked like Laurel would have some company in the near future. Did I need to add a new temple to my valley? Certainly not. Was I going to? Fuck yet. Chapter 102. Village Business. After nearly a week of work passing out potions in disguise, things in the village were going along pretty well for Elim. He'd even gotten an audience with the village council. He'd made his case for a voluntary quarantine, and now it was a question of them making up their minds. Just to help y'all understand, I'm serious. I'm leaving the village after this and taking my family. Sickness is coming and most here can't do the same, Elim offered, regarding them with a steady gaze. You need to protect yourselves now, Elim added when the muttering began to test his patience. Elim didn't mind them needing time to think. What he resented was being made to wait on a hard-ass bench while they hemmed and hawed, like they needed a witness. They were free to take a couple days, so long as he was excused. How would a quarantine even help? Mitter asked. He was the village's best blacksmith, the runner-up being his son. A son Elim had left limping for days after the brute put hands on June at a fete. That they were not friendly was an understatement. Keeps people out along with the sickness. Might keep them from spreading it further on or even persuade the Earl not to burn this place to the ground, Elim offered. And you'd know about that? Mitter asked bitterly. Enough. Men talk and it's the Earl's soldiers who do the burning if it comes to that, Elim replied simply. That got the rest of the council talking again, this time in more urgent tones. What disease could it even be? Mitter asked the group, clearly not believing any of it. Does it matter? A village east of here got burned for goat pox when I was a girl and that never killed anyone, old Madame Enot asked sharply. Elim, having never heard of goat pox, sent a message to 42 on the point but hoped to be free before he received a reply. Respected elders, might I be allowed to go while you think on this? I'd rather be home just now, Elim asked after a while. That got him some glares, but Bromwell Three Toes, whose feet he'd never seen, waved him off. As headman of the village, it was his right to do so, and even if it wasn't, Elim was off like an arrow freed from a bow. Elim had been telling the truth, he'd rather be heading home, but he wasn't. His feet were taking him to the Holt family house. They were chandlers by trade. Why they insisted on being called as such was beyond him. A candle maker was a candle maker. Though they tended to be a bit unpleasantly proud, Elim didn't much mind the Holts. They'd taken him turning down a marriage with their eldest girl Olidwell after he was widowed. Something which couldn't be said of everyone. Elim? What are you here for, lad? Doris called. She was sweeping the porch of the store that made up the front of her family's home. Space wasn't at such a premium in Selton that anyone bothered with a second story, unlike in the towns. Use common to say thank you, Mrs. Holt. My ma told me you sent cheese and a few things around when she was feeling poorly, Elim said, mostly honest. He genuinely was thankful, and the handcart full of goods he'd taken out of the inventory was full of things he intended to express it with. The lie was in the notion of it being his only motivation. Even discounting 42 and the plan to distribute the potion-laced cider, he was there on a mission. A mission to get a slice of pie. I'm just glad she's feelin' better. Fate wouldn't be the same if she weren't around to lose, Doris said with a grin. Elim couldn't help laughing at that. Come round the back and sit in the kitchen, you might not be family, but you're close enough, she added. Mrs. Holt, Elim said, letting a little warning slip into his voice. Oh, shove off. Growling at me. Olid's trothed to the baker's boy, Adder. You've missed your chance, Doris said, looking a bit gleeful. Elim couldn't help but laugh at that. Last he'd seen of Adder, the young man was red-faced and hiding behind a tree out of fear of the village girls. Still, Khalid was a smart one and kind enough. They'd likely be just fine as husband and wife. As Elim let Doris lead him around the back of the house, he couldn't help a smile. It hadn't been often, but often enough, he'd come around to play with her second son Nicholas before he'd been sent off to a cousin to learn a trade. Nicholas had made the mistake of mentioning soldiering around Doris and she'd all but tied him and his luggage to the horse that night. "They wedding at the fete?" Elim asked. It wouldn't be hard to scrounge up a gift or two given who his employer was. "I'd like for it, but her cold will need to break first and be gone a while." "Wouldn't do to get half the village sick," Doris said. Elim paused, frozen a moment in the back door that led into the kitchen. "Look at you, gone pale. Isn't anything serious, we've all had it. Was only your ma who got a bit unlucky with the blue veins, but even she pulled through," Doris said, patting him on the arm. Elim nodded mutely, recalling what 42 had told him. Blue veins was the body rejecting bloody mana fever. Those who got it and would die just took sickly for a bit, entirely unaware of the dread thing that had taken residence in their body. "You know, be that as it may. I've got something a bit special that I think wouldn't go amiss," Elim said, stepping back out to the cart. He took out the basket of goods from under the cloth cover, discreetly adding something from the inventory. "Oh Elim, lad, that's too much," Doris said, clucking her tongue. "Add it to Khalid's dowry or one of her sisters," Elim said, waving the matter off. He pulled a particular jug out of the basket, looking back toward the door furtively. "So, mind you don't tell anyone, but while I was away we did a bit of work for a church of Tima. Nothin' grand, mind you, but they felt it worth repaying, so they passed this on," Elim explained. He offered the jug of mirth of Tima cider to Doris, who just looked confused. "Nice of em," Doris said as if she didn't quite believe it. Which in fairness she shouldn't, since Elim was lying through his teeth. He'd paid good coin for it and only been able to justify the expense because 42 had said it did in fact fall under his food expenses, bless her. "Not sayin' it does anything, but you know those holy types. Might be a bit of luck for the house if you all have it with dinner. Maybe invited her and his master over," Elim said conspiratorially. Doris looked at him narrowly, but had already shifted her hold on the jug possessively. No matter what else she might decide, he definitely wasn't getting that back. "Don't think I don't know what you're after, boy," Doris said harshly. Elim blinked, genuinely taken by surprise. There wasn't a snowball's chance in a forge she knew what he was about, so only the gods knew what wildness she'd cooked up on her own. "They're too young for a pledge, but I'll keep Bess in mind for my lorry when they get to be old enough." "Never hurts to have friendly relations between families," Doris said, preening a bit. Elim opened his mouth, then closed it again as what she said sunk in. "True enough, and you're right about them being too young," Elim said with a nod. He wasn't about to go and have his daughter pledged to anyone, not until she was old enough to pick for herself. Betrothal usually happened around 16 with marriages around 18, he liked 20 better, but he'd just have to see how things went. Elim could remember with poignant clarity how his own mother had warned him to get to know June better before jumping in boots first. He hadn't listened and he didn't exactly regret it, but wished he'd done it different all the same. "Elim, are you listening?" Doris asked rather sharply. "Beg your pardon, was just thinking about the future," Elim offered a bit weakly. His mind had been on the past, but he wasn't about to share that. "Ah, growin' up yourself's almost as hard as watch em do it," Doris offered. "Now, what were you saying before I rudely drifted off?" Elim asked, summoning what he hoped was a winning smile. "Nothing much. I was just thinking you ought to bring your family and that new woman who's been staying with you round for dinner. Only I'm a bit worried, I'd like to make my good pie, but I'm low on some things," Doris explained, looking a bit put out. Elim nodded sagely in agreement, not that he cared, until her words sunk in. Pie? Elim asked. Otar really loves it and I think it would go with the cider. Only I'm low on sugar and eggs, I wasn't planning to buy any until just before the fete, Doris explained. Oh, come now. That's nothing to worry about, just tell me what you need and I'll pop round and get it for you. Least I can do, all things considered, Elim said quickly. If you're sure? Doris asked, looking pleased but concerned. Definitely, we're near enough to family, you hardly need to ask, Elim said with his most winning smile. He was probably 6 kinds of a bastard for playing on her misunderstanding about Bess and Laurie, but he genuinely needed the pie to happen. If that meant compounding the lie, so be it. Chapter 103. The Continuing Awkward Adventures. The day after Elim got me his pie sample I found myself facing a fairly serious issue. Hecha and Myra seemed ready to make a deal, but I'd screwed up during our prior conversation. They didn't know I was the dungeon master and I had no idea if that would be a deal breaker. More honestly, I would have to admit I didn't want it to be and was sorely tempted to just not tell them. I'd talked about building partnerships on honestly, but fucking hell was my actual nature a problem. I wouldn't blame them if they refused once I told them. I think you would be better off discussing this with Henry, mistress, Dawn said from the couch. She was sorting through fabric and bead samples for her wedding dress. Dress here just referring to the outfit, she hadn't settled on if she was wearing pants or not. Everything was bright shades of red, yellow, and orange, celebratory colors among her people. White was kind of a thing on my old world in some places, I offered, flat out ignoring what she'd said. White? Wouldn't that be expensive and stain easily? Dawn asked, looking confused. Yeah, that was actually kind of the point. It wasn't expressly the fashion until a particular royal wore a giant-ass dress and rich people got into it, then everyone else, I explained. I think anyway. Kind of think I wasn't the type to peruse bridal catalogs for fun, I added. This was one of the random spots where I wasn't sure how accurate my information was. I may well have thought it was true or just not given enough of a shit to actually look into it at the time. Bridal catalogs? Dawn asked, confusion deepening. Picture books that showcase wedding supplies. They'd have images of dresses, china fancy dishes, party setups, stuff like that, I clarified. Your world was strange, Dawn said simply. I could only shrug at that. I didn't really disagree, though I didn't find my current one terribly heavy-handed with the sense-making. So, why are you avoiding Henry? Dawn asked. Fuck, I hissed. I'd hoped Dawn wouldn't recall asking me and ruined my chance to pivot with the curse. She just smirked at me. It's complicated, I said lamely. That didn't begin to cover it. Well, I don't need to eat or sleep, and can't die of boredom. So I imagine if you start talking you'll manage to explain it to me eventually, Dawn said rather archly. I flinched a little. She wasn't wrong, but that did paint a grim picture of my speaking skills. It's an ethical thing. There's what's called a power disparity between us since he literally can't disobey me, I started. The terms hopefully made sense since Dawn wasn't interjecting with a question. I'm also kind of scared, I added before I could chicken out. Of? Dawn asked. Well, I wouldn't say I've had romantic feelings for him all that long, but I have liked him from pretty much the day I summoned him. If he can't disobey an order, it's possible I'm influencing him, even if it's not intentional, I explained. Dawn tilted her head as she considered the idea, then pushed up into a proper sitting position on the floor instead of laying on it. I'd offered her the couch but she'd declined. Mistress. I've served before. I've never encountered a master who encouraged their monsters to think or be themselves before, but the degrees of control certainly varied, Dawn started. I nodded, wanting to encourage her, but not trusting myself to say anything intelligent. I kind of knew what I could or couldn't do on an instinctive level when it came to certain things. Like I couldn't order a monster to disobey me or not listen ever again. They would still default to obedience if I issued an order after that. Aside from that and a few other specific cases and what was in the manual, everything else was a gray area. The more profound it is, the more obvious it becomes. Dawn paused, biting her lip and thinking. Master Sama, are you Dejavu? I remember a succubus who'd repeat that and nothing else. It was like she was sleepwalking through the day in the throne room where I stood guard. Dawn began. I cringed, having a pretty good guess what that poor creature was subjected to. I never spoke to her personally, but I did see her again in a different dungeon. Her personality was very different when she wasn't being so heavily controlled. She was alert and able to make choices when she was less so. That sounds utterly fucking awful, I offered as a shiver ran through me. My point is, if you were able to influence us like that, I'm pretty sure Chris wouldn't behave like a half-mad goblin quite so freely. You might be tolerant, but I'm fairly certain you'd curtail quite a lot of what he does if it were simply a question of your preference, Dawn said. You make a compelling case given the recent rash of moonings, I said and sighed. Chris was very fond of his newly fleshy ass for entirely awful reasons. Such was the way of Chris. Let's pretend I knew that with certainty. It doesn't change that he has to obey an order. I'm basically God in this dungeon, I said, knowing that the basic problem was essentially unsolvable. Pardon me if I don't build a shrine, Dawn said flatly. I'll build my own, should it suit me, I growled back. I would do no such thing, not unless one counted my personal quarters. Something I hoped no one did. I wasn't going to do anything ridiculous like decorate it with statues of myself like an egocentric lunatic. You are more of a nervous mayor than a god, Dawn said then snorted. God, mayor, inmate running the asylum, semantics, I said with a shrug. I was fine with not all of that registering for Dawn as I chuckled. Fuck it, I'm going to tell the girls the truth and we'll just see where the chips land, I said, scrubbing my face with a hand. Fuck around and find out was not an ideal operating procedure for social situations, but it was the best I had for the moment. Ripping the wound open, I see, Dawn said. What? I asked, my orbs fluttering. That thing you say. To get it over with, Dawn replied with a shrug. Rip the band-aid off, I offered. It's a small sticky bit of bandage you put over minor wounds, but it kind of stings when you pull it off. Doing it faster isn't exactly better, but at least it's over with quickly. Can you make those too? Dawn asked. I know absolutely jack shit about how the adhesive works. I don't know, I guess I could mess around and try though, if you think it will be useful, I offered. Medical supplies usually are, and you mentioned wanting to bring people here to live, Dawn said with a shrug. That was a good point. I really needed to focus better and plan for people to move in, rather than leaving it as a nebulous eventuality. I'll put that on the to-do list. In the meantime, I'm going to worry myself into knots trying to think of what to say. That and possibly upgrading a pie recipe, I said then sighed. I'd already deconstructed the sample Elim sent me and given him a copy of the recipe. Pie? Dawn asked, clearly not understanding why I'd bother. Neither of us ate or had a sense of taste. Upgrading the pie recipe and its ingredients at this point was largely just a whim on my part. Still, if Elim's mother wasn't fully appeased, she might look kindly on some higher grade ingredients or an improved one. I sort of doubted it though. If she was really into making pies, she might use the recipe as a reference, but would likely just try to improve her own in contrast rather than produce an improved knockoff. Elim's mom knows what I am. So now he's trying to dig himself out of the trouble that put him in with her, I explained. And his solution is pie? Dawn asked, clearly skeptical. I'm not saying it's going to go well, I offered with a shrug. It wasn't a great idea, but I didn't have a better one. My apologizing outside of letter format was out of the question, since seeing me or even just hearing my voice would likely make it worse. Some god you are, Dawn said. Affronted, I smacked her with my tail before I could think better of it. The motion landed like a very light pillow, my body not generating force in a sensible way as per usual. Dawn just laughed at me and the pathetic attack. It wasn't like I wanted to hurt her anyway, but it was still a bit frustrating. I repent. Dawn said, a mortal being would have been wheezing. I just glared. Before I could think of anything to say, a communication stone started chirping. It looked like Hecha and Myra wanted to talk, something I was -% prepared for. Chapter 104. Dealing with it. After staring at the communication stone for a moment, I picked it up. It was a small glossy black stone with a communication glyph on it. Feather light normally, but just then it felt heavy. Mistress 42, Myra said politely. Myra, how can I help you? I asked. I turned my back on Dawn as I did, not wanting to get distracted. Something that happened rather too easily with me, even when I wasn't flustered. We wanted to discuss what you brought up before, about building a town, Myra replied. I felt my lack of a stomach drop. It was the expected topic, but still uncomfortable at the moment. I'm going to send you a contract offer to consider, I started. There wasn't an easy way to do this. So, as Dawn had said, it was time to rip the wound open because this sure as fuck wasn't a band-aid situation. Very well. Myra said, sounding surprised. While you do, you should think carefully about. I told you before that I don't work for the Dungeon Master, I said only to hesitate. You lied. Hecha's voice cut in. She didn't sound surprised and I couldn't help a sigh at that. It probably would make more sense on some level to them. No, I didn't. Look, I'm not social generally. So when you asked that question I answered it, but not fully explaining was its own kind of lie, even if it was unintentional. The conversation got away from me and then I was too off balance to tell you what I should have at the time, I explained. It felt kind of cathartic to just tell them honestly that I sucked at peopling. It didn't help anything really, but it was a load off my mind at the very least. I heard some argument in the background and what might have been the stone being dropped. The connection cut at the very least. It resumed a moment later though. All right, so what is the truth? Myra asked calmly. The truth is I can't work for the Dungeon Master, since I am the Dungeon Master, I said. Part of my brain unhelpfully supplied I could if I decided to consider myself self-employed. I told that unhelpful part of my brain to go sit in a corner and think about what it had done. The bad one, full of imaginary spiders. This time when the call cut I didn't hold out hope it would resume in a few minutes. I was going to be lucky if they weren't frantically packing and running for the stone maze. Feeling a not entirely unexpected surge of depression, I went and slumped down on the couch. Dawn patted me on the head and I felt pathetic enough to lean against her side and let her keep doing so. It certainly wouldn't do anything for my dignity as a dungeon master, but I didn't care about that at the moment. I felt like shit, and her stroking my hair like I was an overwrought toddler felt nice. I'm pretty sure I just fucked that up completely, I said after a few moments. Quite likely, Dawn offered simply. I sighed, irritated but ending up laughing at the end. I really had, and it was no one's fault but my own. Still, it was kind of funny from a certain perspective. If I squinted. Well, it's not like I can't still build a town. I mean, I've been planning it for a while. Having them to help get new settlers would have been nice, but it's not like I don't have other options, I said, though if it was to inform Dawn or convince myself was unclear. The boy, Elim, could do as much, Dawn offered. True, I agreed. You'd rather he didn't though. Why? Dawn asked. How exactly she'd picked up on my reluctance with me barely saying anything was a vexing little mystery, but one that would have to wait until later I suspected. I'm not totally against it, it just wouldn't work quite the same. The Lawduran need a place to stay, so roaming them here probably wouldn't be hard. Particularly with Hecha doing the recruiting, I started. Elim's human end. Well, I don't know how well they'd respond to him even if he's willing to do it, I continued. Stromolt's human population had enslaved the Laduran. I wouldn't blame the lot of them for not trusting him given what happened. That was traumatic on a scale I was comfortable with admitting I didn't have a grasp on. There's also a strong possibility of a plague outbreak happening soon. If I were in his position, I wouldn't want to be separated from my family for long and definitely would want to settle them somewhere safe before I went anywhere, I continued. That does make sense, but you could order him to do it, I believe, Dawn replied. I sat up at that suggestion, not happy but less with Dawn and more with the situation. I liked the security that magic contracts afforded me, but I couldn't shake my disgust with that aspect. It was one thing to strike a deal and have it be followed by both parties. Nothing I'd asked for was particularly terrible and the rewards were reasonably generous. What I didn't like was how far that compliance could truly be pushed with the right wording and a degenerate mind. That's true, but I don't want to force him to do things. I'd rather talk and convince him or figure out a compromise, I said after only a brief moment of contemplation. Offer him the farm then. I doubt there are many places where his family would be safer, Dawn offered. My orbs fluttered at the suggestion. It had actually been on my mind for quite a while. So long in fact, it felt weird to hear someone say it. That's not wrong, but don't you think it would make him uncomfortable? I asked, wanting to agree but unwilling to rush. I'd already fucked one relationship up today, I didn't need to try for a double. Truly, who wouldn't resent being offered a small palace surrounded by unflagging guardians to safeguard their family, Dawn said dryly. I opened my mouth to say something, then closed it. I'll think about it, I said, hesitant but a little excited. As I sat wondering what I should do, if anything, about the situation with Myra and Hecha, I got a notice. Andrea and Mina had both agreed to the secret-keeping pact formally. Presented with a new and interesting option, I checked on the farm. Myra and Hecha hadn't left yet. That worked nicely for what I was thinking about doing. I started quickly sketching things out and pulling items from my inventory. You look like you have a plan, mistress, Dawn said with a smirk. Half of one, but what the hell, I replied, only giving her a fraction of my attention. Since everyone knew what I was anyway, I didn't have a specific reason to keep Andrea and Mina prisoner in the dungeon anymore. Sadism wasn't my thing. I grabbed the communication stone matching theirs and waited for one of them to pick it up. Mina, Andrea, how would you guys feel about having dinner with Myra and Hecha? I asked before they could identify themselves. Bad that they ended up stuck down here. Mina replied after a slight pause. I could have kicked myself but decided to just rebound instead of wallow. Let me restate that. Since you agreed to the deal, you're both free to go, but it's late in the day. Myra and Hecha are both staying in a house in the valley. I thought I'd let you all meet up and give you some gear while you talk over what you want to do next, I said quickly. Releasing prisoners wasn't exactly a grand gesture of goodwill, mostly because I'd had to keep them prisoner to release them, but it was something. It was probably ill-advised to hope for anything, but I thought they might change their minds after a decent meal and getting to talk. If it failed though, they'd all be safer together than apart. Let us out now, Andrea said sharply. Rightfully, she didn't like me and had only mellowed marginally after the issue with the food was cleared up. She sounded a bit panicked at the moment rather than purely upset though. Hearing she could leave but still being stuck was likely doing a number on her. Andrea, chill. Mina hissed at her friend. No, that's fair. This might feel weird. I've never done it to non-monsters before, I said. Done what? Andrea demanded. Rather than explain, I just went ahead and moved them from the safe zone cum prison to the area directly in front of the farmhouse. I heard a pair of frightened shrieks and opened my security feed. Both girls were clinging to each other and freaking out pretty good at the sudden location change. I didn't think talking to them would help the situation, so I busied myself with the other half of my plan. I dropped a table a short way from them and then put the best of the food and dessert options, according to Elim, I had in stock on said table. After a moment's hesitation, I also added in some booze. Wine, cider, and ale joined the rather haphazard collection of food. This was not my best work from a presentation standpoint, but it would have to do. I cobbled some lanterns on sticks to sub in for tiki torches and lit the area up so it would still be comfortable once it got fully dark. Chairs were the last thing to go in, because I'd honestly forgotten about them until that point. Nothing happening was fancy, and I rounded it out with packs of equipment. I was going to keep my word and let them bolt if they wanted to with proper gear. I didn't want them to, but I was going to if that was what they decided. What in Eula's Myra and Hecha had appeared in the doorway. They took in Andrea and Mina for a moment and the other girls looked back at them. All four were in shock for a moment. Belatedly I realized I'd forgotten to mention the dinner idea to Myra and Hecha, which was a pretty gross oversight on my part. I wasn't even sure if they wanted to see Mina and Andrea. My concerns about a fight breaking out were dispelled when they started running toward each other in the dimming light of the day. It was a bit awkward because they all were crying as they embraced. They were glad they were all alive to reunite, and feeling awkward about my role in the matter I closed my security feed and left them to catch up. Chapter 105. Questionable Life Choices. Myra looked at the gathering and felt a strange heaviness. She'd consigned the other girls to a miserable death in the dungeon, but now they sat across the table from her. After the initial tears and apologies, they all felt awkward and turned to eating rather than talking. It was easier. So 42 had you both locked up this entire time? Hecha asked, tone biting. Yet. She wouldn't let us out until we agreed to the pact to keep her secrets. We did that just before we showed up, Mina supplied. As usual, she was the most chipper of the group, now that her mind was in working order again. Andrea, by contrast, was sullen instead of brash. I hope she didn't harm either of you after the fight, Myra offered. She wouldn't put anything past anyone, she'd seen too much, but torture didn't seem like something 42 would indulge in. A certain squeamishness had come across in their prior conversations. No, actually she gave us potions, though we didn't use them. I mean, they appraised as safe according to my skill, but neither of us trusted them or her at the time, Mina replied. How exactly did you two get free of your pendants? Hecha asked. They weren't like the slave collar with a killing curse on them, but none of them had been able to help each other before, despite trying. They were gone when we woke up, Andrea said flatly. Yet, I don't really remember what happened after Reiner used Andrea as a shield. I think most of the fight is fairly clear, but a lot of stuff is fucked up in my head because of that necklace, Mina added and sighed. My memories are clear, but my collar wasn't the same, Hecha said unhappily. Myra, not to be a dick, but why didn't Eula warn you about any of this? Since before the chaining. The whole kingdom became a total shitshow, Mina asked. Hecha bristled, but Myra restrained her with a hand on her leg. It was a fair question. It probably wouldn't have helped, Myra began. Andrea snorted at that, but didn't otherwise speak. Eula isn't a god of destiny but of possibilities. They don't hand out revelations that might make things worse or cause something specific to happen, they only speak to give a guiding suggestion. Like your story about death in the market, they wish to avoid causing undesirable things, Myra continued. Death in a market? Hecha asked, looking at Mina curiously. So imagine if death were like a physical person. So a guy goes to a market and sees death who looks at him strangely, Mina began. Thinking his time is up and wanting to avoid it, he borrows a horse from a friend and rides all night to a distant city. The next day when the friend he borrowed the horse from sees death at the market, he asks what it was all about. Death says they were just surprised because they had an appointment with the guy in the morning in that distant city, Mina finished. Okay, Hecha said solemnly. Myra knew that meant she didn't quite get it but didn't want an explanation. Being a guardian of the tower did involve a basic education in the teachings of Eula, but didn't require faith, per se. It was enough to take the job and the safety of the tower's inhabitants seriously, which Hecha always had. Hecha and I only found out 42 was the dungeon master shortly before you both appeared along with the feast, Myra offered. The farewell feast, Hecha muttered. Myra socked her in the ribs lightly to remind her to watch her words. They were still in the valley which appeared to be part of 42's domain. It wouldn't be wise to talk shit as Mina would call it. Also that boy at the bar set us up, Hecha said, not bothering to be quiet this time. Seriously? Why are all the hot guys full of murder lately? Mina demanded of no one in particular. She scrubbed her face with her hands before helping herself to more cider. Plural. Andrea asked, a brow quirking up. My brain was broken, not my eyes. I was aware Reiner wasn't the king of hotness even if I couldn't do anything about fawning on him, Mina replied despondently. Andrea shivered at that along with Myra and Hecha. Nothing had ever come of it but everyone but Hecha had felt compelled to do the same thing. 42 said the man in the bar chose us because he felt we were a threat to his lady companion, Myra offered. They all exchanged looks, then sighed. It was part of the compulsion from what little they knew. Something would attract Reiner to a girl and unless one of them drove her off quickly he'd try and give her a pendant. Why they could act like jealous morons but nothing more productive was a question none of them knew how to answer. Rather like why the pendants made them act strangely or the Church of Strom insisted Reiner become a heavy swordsman rather than the archer he started as. The magic involved had to have been a massive undertaking to create but the execution was beyond bizarre. Well, he wasn't wrong, Mina grumbled. He chose us, so he works for her? Why? Andrea asked. I didn't ask, Myra said honestly. It hadn't occurred to her to question that part at the time. Really she'd been rather busy trying to keep herself and Hecha calm as they spoke. 42 was a strange being to converse with at best. Maybe she grants wishes like a genie, Mina said with a shrug. I doubt it, Andrea growled. We could ask her, Mina said, giving a desultory little chuckle. She held up what looked like a rock but Myra recognized as one of the communication stones. Mina. Those. Start working when you pick them up, 42 chimed in through the stone, cutting Myra off. Ah! Mina shrilled and dropped the stone. Andrea socked Mina on the shoulder none too lightly in rebuke. Sorry. Mina said quickly, slapping the stone away from herself. Myra caught it, her poor vision irrelevant as she had a sudden flash of insight. They weren't quite like visions but a kind of foresight translated through the body. Why Eula wanted her to catch the cursed thing was not revealed even as it fell off the edge of the table into her hand. Strangely 2 more appeared on the table. What? Hecha asked, voice hushed now. They work in pairs, 42 said. Her voice wasn't coming from the stone but somewhere beyond the half-circle of lantern light. Andrea and Mina both bolted over the table to Myra and Hecha's side since the strange dual-tone voice had come from behind them. A pair of pale green flames appeared in the moonless darkness. You said we could leave. Andrea shouted. The offer stands, 42 replied, apparently unruffled. Then why are you here? Hecha demanded. Myra wanted to strangle her, adding fuel to the fire would not help. I thought I should leave you all alone and let you make your decision among yourself. Really, until a few minutes ago that was the plan, 42 said. The flames were moving in the darkness and something near them, a deeper darkness, did as well. It gave the nauseating impression of a serpent that couldn't quite be seen, the eyes trying too hard to find what they could not. What changed? Myra asked, trying to keep her voice even. It occurred to me that I'd offered you a deal, but I hadn't really demonstrated my abilities to any of you, 42 replied. Myra's mind spun for a moment, she hadn't actually looked at the contract yet. She had no idea what she'd been offered nor what a demonstration would entail. That's quite all right, we don't require proof, Myra managed to get out weakly. It felt like her heart had lodged in her throat. I doubt it. You asked for a town, 42 said. We don't need. Hecha was starting to yell but fell silent as an ominous rumble began. The ground began to split open and a weak light spilled out as a building, lit from within, began to rise up out of the earth. Buildings are easy enough for me, but you'd also want security, I assume. A safe place for people to live, 42 continued. People exited the house, all cloaked in a variety of armor from different classes. Their eyes glowed eerily in the dark, but they appeared human. Supplies, opportunities for growth, a chance to build something and have more than a meager living granted at the whim of some inbred asshole with a fancy title, she said as goods rained down from nowhere in front of the table. Fabric, leather, foodstuffs, armor, weapons, dishes, and too much else for them to identify. Delicate things broke as they landed and coins glittered among the mess. All of this is trash to me. I don't have a use for it, nor do I covet it. I'd happily give anyone who came here whatever they needed to get started building a new life. You're not the first monster to line its nest with riches, Mina said. Myra glanced at her and found the other girl had gone rather pale and wide-eyed. Those eyes fixed on the floating flames. True, I'm sure. But I am a monster that will make deals and is bound by contracts. You don't need to trust me, you just have to be careful and you can have what you want, 42 countered. We understand, Myra said, voice coming out louder if not stronger than before. Probably not, but possibly as well as you can. The dungeon, this valley included, is my domain. It's mine to bend into whatever shape I desire, 42 countered. Without warning, the ground behind them rose up, the house suddenly atop a small hill rather than flat land, as shallow stone steps were cut into it leading down to the table. What did you give the boy? What did he sell himself for? Andrea asked. Boy? 42 asked. From the bar, the one who sent us here to die, Andrea replied. There was no rebuke in her tone. She was strangely calm despite her earlier fear and anger. He chose to become my employee, primarily to save his mother from bloody mana fever. Beyond the potions needed for that, I've been able to change his class and buy him a few blessings in addition to giving him a wage for services rendered, 42 said simply, as if anything coming from her mouth was. Artifacts were needed to edit one's class and blessings were the business of saints and popes. Then I want to make a deal too, Andrea said flatly. Andrea, what the fuck? Mina asked urgently. There was a flutter in the dark, the green flames almost seeming to twinkle for a moment. Myra and Hecha both looked at Andrea in open-mouthed surprise. Yeah, Andrea. What the fuck? 42 asked, sounding as astonished as everyone else felt. Chapter 106. Shaky ground. You absolute dumbass. Mina cursed. Andrea shoved her back, not wanting to deal with her or the tears. They hadn't known each other before the pendants. Mina was a late addition to the party. She'd always been strange, openly emotional despite her status as a hero. I'll do as I like, and if I sell my soul it's no one's business but mine. Andrea shouted. Wow, everyone calm down a bit, 42 interjected. No one was really listening to her for the moment, however. Mina shoved Andrea in return. 42. If you accept, we'll have nothing to do with you. Myra shouted. Hey! Andrea cried, not caring that she was being shoved down. She wanted to sell herself, but Myra had been talking about a town to feed the dungeon. There wasn't much hope a single soul would be more enticing to 42, and Andrea felt a rising panic. Andrea hadn't grown up particularly pampered, and her interest in swordsmanship had inclined her even less to delicacy than most. Before everything had happened, she'd had a brash temperament but reasonable impulse control. Now she was lashing out, a fist flying for Mina's face. Hecha got involved, but that didn't cause things to improve. Oh, for fuck's sake! Break it up, 42 growled. The people who'd emerged from the house waded into the fray and quickly pulled the former hero's party apart. I'm not agreeing to shit just yet, so consider this a timeout for everyone, 42 added. Andrea felt the world fizzle oddly, then found herself in a stone room. Unlike the one she'd been imprisoned in, it was rather small and plain, without even a fountain. Only the strange glowing stones embedded in the ceiling cast any light, and she felt a rising panic. Andrea didn't have time to get too far into her new misery. Without warning, the room began to expand, doors appearing along with a long cutout in the wall that let in a rush of air. It filled a moment later with glass. Very quickly Andrea found herself in what looked like a sitting room complete with a dining table and a couch. A glass door of all the mad things led out onto a balcony that seemed to be legitimately outside, going by the stars she could see. 2 additional doors were cut into the plain stone walls, only one of which featured a bolt instead of just a handle. She tried the one with a bolt first and found it led to a corridor not unlike the ones she'd seen before in the dungeon. Opening the other, she found herself looking at a bedroom. A rather grand, if plain one, with a massive bed and several more doors. One led to the balcony, the other to a closet and bathroom respectively. Heading back to the sitting room, Andrea nearly jumped out of her skin. Andrea, 42 commented dryly. The room was fairly well lit, but the chair where the dungeon master sat was held in deep shadow in defiance of anything as mundane as light. Still, it made a bit of a difference, and Andrea was able to see more detail than before. Namely sharp nails and a suggestion of a toothy maw. Mistress, Andrea said flatly. I'd have left you in the valley, but I don't think you want to see the others just now, 42 said. Andrea just nodded, not enjoying being back in the dungeon but without an alternative. About the contract, Andrea started only to be cut off when 42 raised her hand. You're going to sleep, have breakfast when you get up, and we'll talk when I have time tomorrow, 42 declared. Why wait? I'm ready now. Andrea countered. That doesn't paint a flattering picture of your impulse control, kid. I have my own business to attend to. You'll either wait or you can just go ahead and leave now. The magic circle at the end of the corridor will teleport you back to the entry chamber. You'll be able to walk out on your own, 42 replied. Andrea felt a protest bubbling up, but bit back on it. She didn't have any power in the dungeon. As if to emphasize that, 42 seemed to fade from her view, becoming one with the shadows and disappearing. What did you do with her? Mina shouted the moment 42 reappeared. There wasn't much of an indication of the dungeon master's presence physically, they could only see the green flames, but the shift in atmosphere was palpable. I gave her a room for the night, 42 said with a sigh. You locked her up again? Mina countered. Release her, Myra added grimly. So you can all start fighting again? 42 asked. That quieted the group for a moment. Hecha was the only one who hadn't protested yet. She seemed rather unconcerned with the proceedings for the moment, unlike the other two. I'm not promising anything, but I'm going to find out what she wants and why. It's strange she'd be interested in a deal, since up to now she just wanted to leave, she added. She didn't know you could reset classes before, Hecha said. That's a big enough deal that she'd be willing to sell her life to me for it. 42 asked, disbelief clear in her tone. The alternative is going to the Church of Stronghold for the service. So yes. Even I find the idea tempting, Hecha replied. Bun! Myra cried, scandalized. I won't, it's just tempting, Hecha said, trying to placate her partner. Okay. How would that work, if you could get them to do it? 42 asked. Myra and Hecha exchanged glances and shrugged. You pay them an assload of donations and they use a crystal thing, Mina supplied. The other two looked at her in surprise. What? They wanted to make me a saint at first. I ended up seeing a lot of bullshit at the church before I got the pendant, Mina said. A crystal? So, a magic item, which would probably be easy enough to get a look at, 42 said, the last part turning into a mumble. Yeah, seeing them isn't that hard. They usually get put out on the altar as holy relics. The expensive part is getting a priest to activate them, Mina supplied. 42, I meant what I said earlier, Myra said. The conversation was taking an odd turn away from Andrea and she didn't like it. There were several beats of silence before the warriors who'd come out of the house and were lounging on its front porch snickered and made some quiet comments. Hetcha's ears twitched, more than able to pick them up. Hey, shut it. 42 growled. The group disappeared in the next instant but the new house remained. Look, this went sideways pretty hard, for a couple of reasons. Stay, go, do whatever you like. If you're still around tomorrow, Andrea might come down on her own, 42 said as she began to fade from view. The messy pile of goods on the ground likewise vanished along with the feast table and the leftovers. Holy shit! That is so freaky to watch, Mina said. She collapsed to the ground, sitting on her knees. Now they were unobserved, she didn't care even slightly about dignity or putting on a brave face. More than a little bit, Hetcha agreed. What did those men say? Myra asked Hetcha. That. They were joking about if we'd try storming the dungeon again. They were talking about placing bets on how far we'd get now that we can fight properly, Hetcha said after a moment. They did? That is fucked up, Mina said, flopping on her back fully on the thick grass. Was that all? Myra asked, clearly not quite believing it. Something about asking a bard what our epic should be called. He didn't know a word that combined farce and tragedy properly, Hetcha said. She sighed, electing to sit on the ground as well and Myra joined her. Tragomedy, tragic comedy, Mina offered. Is that a word from your world? Myra asked. Probably not, I just made it up, Mina replied and laughed. The others joined in, and if it had a hysterical edge to it, that was their business and no one else's. Chapter 107. Complicated Relations. The day after the farewell feast, Andrea woke up in a bed much more comfortable than it should have been. She'd never known one so soft before, even when Stromhold had been spoiling the party just before its departure. Like most things about the dungeon, she found the incongruency intensely irritating. Even the room Andrea and Mina had been in before had been reasonable. They'd slept in worse inns on the road more than once. The food was also good when she'd finally given in and eaten. Something she'd only done in the end because Mina gobbled a plate full down. She hadn't fancied being left alone if it was poison. Andrea groaned as she recalled the prior evening's argument. She had a few sore spots from where Hetcha had gotten too rough trying to break her and Mina apart. The Lepusen were many things, but weak wasn't on the list, despite the weird way they'd faint sometimes. I'll still go back for my revenge. What does it matter if I sell my soul first? Andrea cringed as she recalled that part. How quiet everyone had gone. It wasn't as if she were insincere, but it sounded ridiculous, and she knew it. They didn't understand. They couldn't because she hadn't told them why she wanted it so badly. Focusing on more immediate problems, Andrea climbed out of bed and looked for but didn't find her clothes. She'd slept in a plain shift she'd found on the bed but could hardly walk around in it. Rather than panic, she took a moment to check where the doors in the room led and found a closet on the second go. A few simple but well-made outfits were waiting, suspended on odd triangles with hooks on the top. In a further bit of strangeness, pants were included in the options. Andrea had worn hose before but still had to wear a dress. Going by the availability of tunics and shirts, it seemed 42 didn't much care about that aspect of her attire, and she was grateful for it. Andrea picked out a tunic and pants with low-heeled boots. They were suitable for fencing, and her sword was atop the dresser where the underthings were. A new sturdy belt waited with it and a bowl of odd fabric loops and lengths of ribbon. They weren't particularly decorative looking, which she found strange. It took Andrea a moment to realize what they were, things to put her hair up. She might not have figured it out if they hadn't been right next to a hairbrush. She was used to having to style it with a fancy braid done up like a crown. It hadn't been a choice of hers, but rather the pendant. Not unlike the fact she'd only worn clothes supplied to her by the Church of Stromholt. Brushing then tying her hair up in a simple ponytail, Andrea felt a little calmer. She could make choices now, and 42 didn't seem interested in limiting them. For the moment, at least. That might well change if they struck a bargain. Andrea didn't particularly care for the feeling that she'd gone from prisoner to pet and did her best to ignore it. Breakfast was waiting for her on the table in the sitting room, along with a letter written in Hetch's blocky but legible hand. She ate before she even considered opening it, knowing it would be from Myra and likely scathing. Andrea. 42 claims you can leave of your own will. Do so. Myra. P.S. Seriously dude, just come back. Mina. Looking at the brief letter, Andrea chuckled for a moment. None of them trusted 42, from what she could tell. Even Mina, who seemed to enjoy having someone to discuss being an outsider with, had no intention of staying around. It was nice but not essential to her in any way. Thinking about it for nearly an hour didn't get Andrea much of anything but frustration. There were supplies on the table to write a reply with, but she didn't bother. They likely wouldn't believe anything they read. 42 was powerful in ways she didn't understand. It would probably seem to be nothing more than a trick. It was nearing noon, going by the sun slanting in the window, when something finally happened. A magic circle appeared on the floor with an inscription on the wall behind it. 42 requests your presence, was all it said in curling but legible hand. Andrea hesitated a moment, not trusting the circle. They'd seen similar ones coming into the dungeon, and Lily had decided against using them. Lily. Andrea had tried not to think about her friend more than she could help. The orphanage where the other girl had grown up was in her father's barony, so they'd known each other most of their lives. Reiner had been present but had shied away from her, wary of the Baron's daughter. Or at least he had when he wasn't caught up in some scheme to try and make money to afford to marry Lily. The only thing that pair of idiots had wanted was to be married as soon as they had enough money to afford a bit of land and a cottage. Instead, they'd been used cruelly and ended up laid to rest in a dungeon. If her rage could have manifested like magic, then Stromholt would have been ashes already. Andrea stepped onto the circle and found herself enveloped in cloying darkness. One deeper than night that felt as if it was a weight pressing in on her. She let out a shriek of surprise, but nothing happened. She controlled herself quickly, though her fear began to build once more. When it felt like Andrea might be crushed by the dark or scream, dim violet lights sprang to life. They revealed something in relief, a door at the end of the cavernous room in which she stood. A room whose walls were some form of black stone as she could only tell them from the deep shadows by the faint reflection of the strangely colored lights. While she tried to think of what to do, possibly find the circle again and run, the door began to yawn silently open. Andrea was at a loss. She was terrified of what lay at the end of the path of lights. The only thing that kept her from running was the lack of a way of retreat. The circle she'd arrived by was gone when she looked back for it. As if sensing Andrea's indecision, the lights began to go out. Those closest to her dimmed first before vanishing. Those further ahead began to dim then as well. She ran for the door before the next set had a chance to go out. More frightened of being left alone in the impossible darkness than the doom that might lay ahead. Still running, Andrea only stopped when she was far into the next room. It was one better lit than the last though not wholly. Here the lights of the path never reflected off any walls, suggesting the chamber beyond them was much larger than the previous one. Ahead of Andrea, the path changed, the lights forming a circle. She slowed as she approached it, sensing 42 in the darkness. She couldn't see her, but the presence of the dungeon master was felt like the weight of the darkness itself even before the fire of 42's eyes were revealed. Andrea stepped into the small pool of light created by the circle and found she could dimly make out a shape in the darkness. A chair covered in faintly glowing symbols was on a dais before her. They served to accentuate but not truly reveal the feminine form that accompanied 42's eyes. Despite everything, she'd assumed a shiver rolled through Andrea from the roots of her hair to the solace of her feet. She was in the throne room of the dungeon master, and it turned her blood into a river of ice. "Should I kneel?" Andrea asked. She'd tried for defiant, but it came out confused and a little scared. Not a strong stance to take at what she hoped would be the start of negotiations. "Only if you want to make this weirder than it already is," 42 replied dryly. "Is it strange for people to seek you to gain power?" Andrea asked. "Oh, no, it seems to be becoming something of a trend, actually," 42 said, then sighed. "Listen, have a seat. I suspect this chat will take a little while." Andrea was prepared to sit on the floor, having only seen the throne. When she glanced behind her to make sure it was clear, she found a black chair waiting. She did as instructed, a little annoyed to find it comfortable, if odd in design. It was far lower to the floor than she was accustomed to and plush. She could imagine the Snobba nobles from the capital fighting over it tooth, nail, and claw. "Now, to be clear, I'm not promising you anything. I'm giving you a chance to try and convince me to make a deal. You will, however, have to face your friends again before any final decision is reached, so don't think you're off the hook there," 42 explained. "Why? Why do I have to see them?" Andrea asked, caught entirely on the back foot. "So you have some time to think about what you very well might be giving up. Hecha and Myra considered making a deal before they knew what I was. You're trying to make one despite being fully aware. This might be the last time you see them, so you should try and explain yourself, if only for your own peace of mind," 42 replied. "That? I don't care what they think of it. I know what I want, and it's to be stronger. Strong enough to avenge myself," Andrea said quickly. She didn't want to talk about it with 42, but the creature would need to know what she wanted if they were going to make a deal. She wasn't going to beg the other girls to understand. She didn't owe them that. "How ominous and vague," 42 muttered. "Vague?" Andrea asked, taken aback. 42 sighed in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of her mother. "Reiner is dead, and I doubt you want to descend into the underworld and kill him a second time. So who exactly do you need revenge against?" 42 asked. Andrea blinked, realizing the conversation would be harder than she expected. She'd thought 42 would do as she asked for a price, then leave her to her own devices. "Why does it matter to you?" Andrea asked, tone coming out harsher than intended. She was more scared than angry now. Afraid she wouldn't get what she wanted despite it seeming nearly in her grasp. "Let's not get into me just now. You should tell me because I won't know what to give you if you don't. Right now, if I gave you a potion to turn you into a troll, it would handily fulfill your request," 42 explained. "You'd be far stronger, well equipped for any more brutal form of revenge, but alas, permanently a monster," 42 added. Andrea shivered. "Trolls ate human flesh. I don't want that. You changed the boy Alim's class. I want something like that, to be stronger as I am," Andrea said after a few moments. "I can do that. Now, who exactly do you intend to take revenge against, and why?" "I won't make a deal without knowing that much," 42 said. "Stromholt. More precisely, the nobility and the church for setting this nightmare in motion and my family," Andrea admitted. She'd raise the entire country from the face of the world given a chance, but she doubted she had anything worth that kind of power to offer 42. "Your family? Why?" 42 asked in surprise. "Reiner didn't give me the lily pendant like the others." "My father did," Andrea said flatly. Chapter 108. Strained Discourse. Myra, Hecha, and Mina were all sitting down to lunch the day after the rather disastrous feast. Despite what had happened, they didn't refuse to eat the food 42 provided. Poisoning them probably wouldn't get her anything. Even if that wasn't true, it might well be preferable to alternative means she could resort to in order to eliminate them. So, even if Andrea comes back, are you guys out? Like, do you not want to discuss a deal anymore? Mina asked. Myra. Hecha asked, as if the matter didn't concern her. That got her a look from both of the other women at the table. Do you think we should stay? Myra asked, a brow raised. I think I'd get us into worse trouble than we're already in if I tried to negotiate a contract, Hecha replied dryly. Fair, Myra said after a moment. Same, Mina offered. Were you thinking about trying for one? Myra asked, surprised. Not really, but kind of. I mean, I want to go home and not many places are going to want a chosen hero who isn't like 100% committed to the bit, Mina said with a shrug. That and I'm really fucking tired of the stingy fuckers not letting me pick my rewards. Like seriously, Stromhold wasn't the first place I went. They said they had to appraise things first but they'd reward me fairly. You know, right up until I want the agility boosting boots they've decided are a long lost national treasure or whatever, Mina said with a sigh. That sounds like a problem, Myra said, trying to be supportive. Oh, totes. I could have probably kicked a lot more ass if I had the right kit to boost my build, Mina said and sighed. Need before greed, she added in a mumble. So you think 42 would let you keep your treasures and wouldn't hold it against you if you found a way to leave? Hecha asked. No idea honestly, but I keep thinking it might not be so bad to ask, Mina admitted. I'm fairly certain you didn't look kindly on Andrea's attempt to make a deal last night, Myra pointed out. Because she was being a noob about it, 42 didn't say anything about souls, but that was like her opening offer. I mean, I'm dumb, but I wouldn't use my soul as a bargaining chip out of the gate, Mina said. But you'd be fine doing 42's bidding? Hecha asked. 42 had mentioned that Aleem served her in exchange for what he received. We'd have to talk about it, not that I'm sure I want to. It's just, it seems like she had a lot to offer, Mina said and shrugged. What do you think about it, Bun, aside from not wanting to do the bargaining? Myra asked. We were willing to make the deal before we knew, so long as 42 didn't force anyone to go into the dungeon. I was angry that she hadn't been honest with us last night, but she could have simply never told us anything, Hecha admitted. The group was quiet for a while as they sat around the farmhouse's kitchen table. It wasn't a particularly comfortable thing to know they were still tempted by 42 and the power she might grant. Even after everything that had already happened, despite 2 of their friends dying in the dungeon. I'm not alright with any of this, but if Andrea comes back and it really seems like it's her own idea, then I'll at least entertain the idea of negotiations with 42, Myra said finally. The other 2 nodded and they left the table, Myra and Hecha retreating for a bit of privacy to the room they'd claimed as their own. Mina, however, decided to have a walk around the valley. She'd been cooped up too long in the dungeon's prison. It had been relatively comfortable, but it was still just one room with an attached bathroom. There hadn't been enough space to exercise, really. Or at least not stretch her legs properly. Rather than head toward the mountain, Mina started for the lake. She knew Hecha had found some kind of temple important to her, but she'd never been religious in her own dimension. The appeal of the local gods, despite being demonstrably real, was even less than that of the questionable ones from home. The 3 didn't meet up again until dusk and dinner were approaching. No grand table appeared this time, though the food was still good. They hesitated to start, seeing a 4th setting. Time passed though and Andrea didn't appear and their moods all turned grim. For fuck's sake, 42's muffled voice declared. A moment later there was a bit of a shuffling sound in front of the door. Without warning, Andrea was deposited suddenly in the chair. She looked mussed up and pissed off but otherwise fine. Mina lunged around the table to give her hug. Ack! Andrea cried, caught off guard. Somebody get a mirror. We should check if she still has her soul, Mina said. What does a mirror have to do with a soul? Hecha asked. She won't have a reflection if she doesn't have one. I think. Or maybe that's just if you're a vampire. Mina said, sobbing and hugging her friend. Myra and Hecha exchanged confused looks, not understanding what a vampire was on top of everything else. I didn't make a deal yet. Andrea snapped, more embarrassed than angry. She wormed out of Mina's grasp and stood awkwardly looking at the rest of the group. 42 says she won't make one with me unless I talk with all of you first, she added. Going to convince us it's for the best and she's good and we should make deals too? Myra asked dryly. Oh fucking. I don't care. Do what you want, but I have to tell you or she won't, so I'm here, Andrea spat. What did she tell you to say? Hecha asked, stilling Myra for the moment with a hand on her leg. My father gave me the lily pendant, not Reiner. I'm going to go back home and destroy everything I can. The church, the nobles, just whatever I can manage, Andrea said determinedly even though her voice shook just a little toward the end. Wait, what? Mina asked, shocked. My father gave it to me. Put it around my fucking neck himself, Andrea replied. Oh, no. Andy. Mina said, going for another hug. Myra and Hecha joining in on this one. Oh stop. I'm not. Andrea's protest dissolved into tears after a few moments. Anger was easier than sadness, but with the other three crying, she couldn't help breaking down. Well, Mina and Myra were crying, Hecha was just hugging her and kind of making a rumbling sound. It was a while before any of them were up to actually holding a conversation, the meal forgotten entirely this time. Despite that, they all remained together in the living room until they were in a better headspace for it. So, 42 didn't refuse. She said you had to explain yourself to us before she'd discuss it further. Myra asked. Andrea had explained what happened while they were apart, which while surreal wasn't anything that alarming. It seemed like 42 had been serious about keeping them apart until they cooled off. Basically, though it's not like she's promised to accept. It's weird, Andrea said, letting out a huff of annoyance. What, you'd rather she just take whatever thing you'd have given her at the time? Which was basically anything. Mina asked. Andrea looked away, sulking a little. Andrea, are you certain this is what you want? I don't think you'll be able to take it back if you don't like some aspect of the deal later, Myra asked. I'm sure, unless you know another way to get my class reset and blessings activated, Andrea replied. The others didn't even exchange glances, the only way they knew of wasn't an option. Still. Let me help make the deal, Myra said finally. Seriously? You expect me to trust you not to refuse on my behalf if you get squeamish about something? Andrea asked in disbelief. Even if I do, it's not like 42 can't offer you the contract without me being involved. Think of this as you getting help making sure it's a good deal, Myra countered. Fine, and, thank you. Honestly, I'm not really good at that kind of thing, Andrea said, a little slow with her thanks, but speaking it nonetheless. You're not the only one, Myra said and laughed while Hecha and Mina looked on sheepishly. Chapter 109. Articulate over-engineering. I looked at the contract, one of 3, and sighed. When Andrea had dropped her bomb at the feast a few days prior, I'd expected to lose out on any chance with the other 3. I was glad that hadn't come to pass, but had a different problem to deal with. The shortest contract, Mina's, was 6 pages long. I was impressed by how much Myra and Mina had managed to think of in terms of fuckery they didn't want to happen. None of it was anything I'd have wanted or done, but I wrote a few things down for reference. Stuff to watch out for when making deals in the future mostly. Given what had happened with the pendants, it wasn't like I could blame them for caution. I wouldn't have blamed them for running the fuck away the moment any of them got free and knew what I was. Overall, wading through migraine-inducing piles of paperwork was a small price to pay. 42. I reiterate, I am not any form of lawyer, nor have I ever been, Aaron said, glaring at me occasionally over the 15-page stack for Myra and Hetch's contract. Yet, well, everyone else looked like they were going to cry or pretended to be illiterate when I asked for help, I replied evenly. I was already bribing him with promises of finding him alchemical supplies. An offer I'd had to bug Aleem about before I could even make it, since it wasn't like I could go shopping on my own. Everyone? Aaron asked, not even bothering to hide his disbelief. I didn't let myself be annoyed into a self-incriminating reply. I also didn't bother sharing that if I'd asked Chris, he'd have probably tried to sneak in something about the ladies having to wear bikini armor or something equally asinine. When it came to the skeletons of the Bone Brigade, as I fondly thought of them, I had a mental list of what kind of advice they were willing and able to offer. With Chris, I just had a mental image of a cat pushing a glass of battery acid off a counter. Aaron settled down, more or less, for a couple of minutes. Despite not saying anything, he was hardly silent. Between sighing, huffing, and shifting, he made his continued displeasure with the situation quite clear. Something needed to change. Look, we both know I'm not above bribes or so proud as to refuse to call them as such. If you want something, just tell me. I get it's frustrating to have to wait and see if I can even find what you already asked for, I said when my tolerance reached critical mass. Aaron looked at me in surprise, though how I knew was still a mystery. He hadn't opted to design an illusion of life yet. He was one of the few skeletons who'd opted to have his natural form altered more. Rather than the symbols I'd come up with, he'd given me new designs to carve into his bones. I thought I'd done a good job originally, but had to admit his looked pretty rad now they were done and glowing a faint magenta. Seeing them, I'd gone so far as to pay a couple of points to upgrade his appearance so they'd go from a dull, barely visible glow to a vibrant one when he cast spells. I'm satisfied with our current arrangement, Aaron said. I felt a little bad when he did, feeling like I'd been too sensitive. Since my chat with Dawn, I hadn't had a lot of visitors. Something I'd kind of written off on being busy and everyone else doing their own thing accordingly. Now though, I had to wonder if I'd just been in a bad mood without realizing it. My explanation would work for pretty much any one of the dungeon denizens, but wouldn't explain the absence of the hounds. Normally I had to invent things for them to do or formally ask them to go play elsewhere to get a moment to myself. Not having seen much of them for the past week and nothing at all for the past 2 days was weird. Right. Okay, the offer stands, but obviously, you don't have to take me up on it, I replied. Explaining why I felt like a dick would take too much time and likely just annoy him or make him feel bad. Probably, it was kind of hard to know which way he was going to break when it came to social things, given how little I usually interacted with him. His default setting seemed to be mild annoyance with most things after all. I'll keep that in mind, Aaron said simply. It took us about 3 days to get through all of the contracts, despite both of us not needing to sleep. I used the paper ones Myra had sent as guides when composing my counter offers, which were mostly just abbreviated versions of what she'd come up with. The system alerted me to a couple of balance issues, some of them in my favor for a change, but those didn't take long to sort out. Sweet fuck, round 1 is done. I cried victoriously, doing a swoopy happy dance. I offered Aaron a high five and he held up a hand as a confused reply. When I smacked his with mine he looked offended. It's a thing from my home world, I offered. He nodded though he seemed suspicious. Your people were, very tactile, Aaron said after a moment. Dude, compared to the locals? Bunch of hedonists, I said and couldn't help a laugh. I wouldn't call the people Aleem described to me on occasion puritanical, but they didn't touch all that freely if they weren't family or involved. Casual fist bumps would have come across as weird. Which was probably why Chris had immediately adopted that particular gesture the moment I rather thoughtlessly taught it to him. Well, I suppose it is worth celebrating that we'll have a few days before they respond with counter offers, Aaron said finally. Right? The system helps keep things relatively fair, but I'm sure they're all going to have notes and concerns, I said, then sighed. I wasn't looking forward to a repeat of the paperwork slog I'd just endured, but such was life. I enjoyed about an hour of peace and routine while I did my best to unwind. I wanted to see what the hounds were up to and make amends if needed. Still, I figured I should be in a better mood before I did. They were sensitive to things like that. Toward that end, I had some chaos cola and stretched out on the couch with the design work I was a bit behind on. It was hardly mindless, but I found it enjoyable, which was good enough. Contract accepted, Andrea. I spat a mouthful of chaos across, and thus through, the display I'd been working on. Covered in whatever made up the fluids in my mouth and soda, I was flailing and cussing slightly more than I would have been even if I hadn't besmirched my couch's honor like that. Andrea's original contract had been 10 pages, the counter I'd sent back had been 5. Even scheming, assuming she'd opened it immediately, I doubted she'd gotten through and understood everything clearly in only an hour. She probably hadn't asked for a second opinion either. I doubted her friends would take that well. I was starting to suspect that Andrea was actively trying to fuck over my questionable public image at this point. For a solid minute, I considered how I was going to handle this new hurdle when something inside me just snapped. This might well fuck me over, but until it did I was going to let it ride. I needed and actually wanted to check on the hounds, unlike this bullshit. Time for some pet therapy. I'd peopled enough for the week. Chapter 110. Appropriate Priorities. I didn't know exactly what to expect when I went to visit the hounds. I thought something along the lines of grumpy pups and possibly having to bribe them with treats. I was not expecting to find Stalin pacing anxiously in front of the den. Stalin growled at my approach, then seemed to realize who exactly he was growling at. He whimpered a little, hanging his head. I was down on his level to pet him immediately, worried. "Hey buddy, what's up?" I asked. Stalin had grown to be more affectionate over time, but now he was cuddling into me like he was scared of something. "She's acting strangely," Stalin said, looking toward the den. "I'll check on her, okay?" I asked. Stalin didn't reply, but I approached the den anyway and he remained behind me. Another rather remarkably bad sign. I checked Blackmore's monster listing just to be sure, but I wasn't seeing any status ailments or anything else. I wasn't sure if that was a good sign or not as I crouched by the entrance. I heard a soft whining issuing from inside the den, but didn't see Blackmore's glow. Originally it had started with a single chamber, but at her request I'd added the second whelping one. "Blackmore, it's 42, can I come in?" I asked. I didn't receive a reply and the whining intensified a little. Worried, I slithered inside, my bizarrely elastic anatomy working in my favor. Blackmore was in the second chamber and she didn't look well. Her normal lava-like internal light was dimmer than I'd ever seen it before. It was only a soft glow where it showed through the cracks in her stone-like surface, rather than its normal healthy hellish light. "Hey, what's wrong?" I asked, at a loss. "I feel cold, and hungry," Blackmore replied softly. I was taken aback by the second part. Elementals didn't actually eat per se. They lived off mana, even though they might have things they liked to chew on. If she was feeling hungry, then something had to be wrong with the amount of mana she was getting. "Oh shit, hey, it's going to be okay," I said softly, petting her gently to soothe her. Blackmore looked up and shifted a little to press into the hand petting her. I started digging furiously through my interface looking for an explanation, but didn't find one. My thoughts kept coming back to the upkeep cost. The fire mana in the area was strong enough to sustain 2 adults, but that was it. Even so, if there was a deficit then it should have come out of my mana supply. I looked up elemental hounds specifically, but the text on the subject wasn't any more illuminating. That was when a possible problem occurred to me. The text only gave facts about naturally occurring hounds, not system-bound ones specifically. This might be a problem related to that aspect rather than Blackmore's biology itself. I'm going to try something, I added. While I worked, I snuggled in with Blackmore to try and comfort her, since she normally loved nothing more than getting up in my personal space. It was evening and Mana refresh was hours off, but I broke my own rules. I nuked every point of mana I had on lava tiles. It didn't seem to do much, but I hadn't expected it to. I hadn't really added that many tiles with my leftover mana. It also wouldn't do anything if she were having some kind of absorption problem. Should I call Stalin in to snuggle with us? I asked. Rather than wait on me to extend the invitation, Blackmore barked with a little more energy, in that she seemed to have any, and he came scrambling inside immediately. Holed up in a literal hole with the hounds, I sent out a mass text letting the skeletons know where I was but not why, and that I'd only be accepting texts until further notice. I let Henry, Don, Aaron, and Chris know a bit more though. Aaron was a bit of a long shot, but I felt like if anyone would have a shot at figuring out a magical beast malady, it would be him. Chris texted me back immediately. Mistress. Are pups okay? I stared at the message for a moment in confusion. Then I looked at Blackmore. Aside from the obvious issue with the intensity of her inner fire, I couldn't really say I noticed anything different about her. Though in fairness I was also in a cuddle pile with her and Stalin rather than having her up on a show block for examination. Blackmore, are you pregnant? I asked. Maybe, Blackmore said after a moment of thinking. I felt the news hit me like a slap. I'd given permission for them to have puppies, but it was contingent on the fire area being big enough to support a possible litter. I'd been growing it steadily, but it was just recently large enough to support them without an extra mana cost. That still didn't explain what I was seeing. Or rather, it wouldn't if the potential puppies were bound to the system. In that case they'd probably pull from my mana like their parents to supplement any deficit in the dungeon itself. If they weren't though, it might not compensate. Okay, I said in a bland but soothing tone. Or at least what I hoped was one. If I were on the right track there was a possible treatment. When refresh hit I broke every single one of my carefully designed rules and bought nothing but lava tiles, reserving nothing. My dungeon was constructed well enough that nobody would likely be able to reach my core in less than a day. Not unless they had some fairly insane speed buffs and were high enough level to solo everything. If that were true though, I'd be fucked anyway, and I wasn't going to leave Blackmore to suffer due to my paranoia in the meantime. This time there was a visible effect. Blackmore literally brightened a bit, though she was still lethargic. That a little better? I asked. The lick to my face from Blackmore was the most reassuring thing that could have happened, as it involved her sitting up a little to reach. Thank you, mistress. Stalin enthused, thanking me almost ferociously in Blackmore's place. I'm happy it worked. I can't do more for the rest of today, but I'll keep this up until she's okay, I said after a moment of consideration. I had things to do, but none of them required my physical presence. At least not for the moment. Though I hadn't had anything worthwhile to add to my earlier messages, Chris kept sending me question marks every couple hours. It was actually kind of touching that he was so worried. I was glad I finally had something to tell him. Chris. Not sure, but hopefully. I think I know what's wrong, but it will take a few days to sort out. I'll stay with Blackmore in the meantime. -42. I felt lighter after sending the text. Even if I was wrong about the reason, I'd clearly bought some time to figure the matter out more thoroughly. Aaron wasn't exactly happy about being drafted as a magical veterinarian, but he showed up after some considerable preparation time. I'd told him what I suspected, but he'd gotten together, and in several cases made, magic tools to do a more in-depth diagnostic. Blackmore and Stalin weren't happy with the idea of the skeleton being in their den, even to help, but they allowed it. Blackmore felt a little better, but she wasn't up to moving and didn't want me to take her out of the den with my teleportation ability. Stalin stepped out and Aaron crawled in to do the checkup. It turned out Blackmore was in the very early stage of what would be considered an elemental hound pregnancy. So that's weakening her? I asked. No, or rather it shouldn't. Mistress, does it say anything about hounds being born with cores in your library? Aaron asked. I shook my head. I'd reread the limited information several times already. To prove it, I had the encyclopedia entry turn into a book briefly so Aaron could look it over. He tended to like that better than dealing with interface windows. I won't claim to be an expert, but minor elementals normally aren't this stable. They don't start with cores, but gain them by killing others of their kind or living in mana-rich areas, Aaron began. The pups, as you call them, should be born without them, bursting from her like flames and then either growing or perishing eventually, he continued. But that's not what's happening. I asked. No, she's condensing mana into cores. It's what weakened her so, if they are born like this they'll be unusually strong, Aaron explained. He lapsed into silence while staring thoughtfully at Blackmore. Is that problematic for her health or something? I asked. Not if you supplement the mana supply quickly enough, though I have no idea how long you'll have. It's just that such strong elementals will likely be difficult to control if they're born free, Aaron explained. Mistress? Blackmore asked, sounding confused. It's all right, you're just gonna be a busy mom, I said gently. I stroked her head and she settled back down, content to take me at my word. How many is she likely to have? I asked Aaron. I'd already made up my mind this would be happening. All that remained was to try and brace for the new arrivals. That meant making sure they'd have enough mana and space to roam around in. 3, it seems at least. I can't predict how many will stay stable or if only ones with cores will be born, Aaron said after a few moments to think. 3 sounded manageable, so I hoped that was the number. Oi! Keep it you mutt, my business is with the lady, someone shouted. A moment later, a very singed skeletal Chris was crawling his way into the den, sans most of a leg. Hello mama dog, how are we feeling? Chris asked cheerfully. Tasty Chris. Blackmore said, tail wagging a bit though she didn't get up. I thought Chris was reaching over to pet her with his offhand right up until Blackmore took it in her mouth and tried to tug it free. Chris, seeing she was weak, obligingly popped it off at the elbow then started petting her with his other hand. Blackmore gnawed softly on Chris's arm and some of his more random respons suddenly made sense. I felt like I should probably say something about what was clearly a fairly fucked up thing to do, but couldn't find it in me. It was all so precious and I decided to split the difference and file it under fucking adorable. I was numb to worrying about what that said about me as a person. Aaron, who wasn't far off from respawning himself after prolonged exposure even to Blackmore's currently cooler temperatures, excused himself. I teleported him back to his lab so he wouldn't have to pass through the lava area and end up respawning. Chris, for his part, hung around until he literally couldn't anymore, which was about 5 minutes after Stalin muscled his way back into the den. Curled up with the hounds I went about my other work. We'd need to talk about why they didn't come to me when Blackmore started feeling unwell eventually. For the moment it wasn't worth fussing about. That was a discussion for when she was well again, which I was determined would happen, come hell or high water. Chapter 111. Incoming. It took 2 more days of buying lava tiles to get Blackmore back to normal. Still, I spent the full week adding on. I wanted to be ready for when the puppies eventually appeared. Given what had happened to Blackmore herself, I was worried it might affect their health if they weren't linked to the system when they were born. I was more measured about how I went about it after the first couple of days, however. I used my normal reserve method for my mana. Outside of that, I hung around in the den and the surrounding area once Blackmore felt up to getting a little exercise. Since I was in the lava area anyway, I went to work improving it as I added new tiles. It took on a more natural appearance fairly quickly and I let the hounds make requests like normal. When I wasn't caught up doing that, I worked on my other projects, but my heart wasn't really in them. With everything going on, I expected problems or complaints to crop up, but the Bone Brigade was pretty quiet. Something I attributed in part to the fact that Chris was spending most of his time respawning and then coming back to burn while he checked on Blackmore. Without him making trouble, things were fairly calm all around. Less welcome was the relative silence from the girls in the valley. Still, I hadn't exactly been expecting them to turn chatty out of nowhere, and they had contracts to consider. I did check in and see they were still present in the evening, but that was all. I had to drop food off anyway, so I'd have been observing them, one way or another. My curiosity about how Andrea was doing was tempered by my decision to let her sort it out on her own. I wasn't pleased she might have ruined my chance at making more deals, the second time no less, but it also wasn't the end of the world. I was caught pretty much flat on my tail when I suddenly had 3 contract agreement notices come through at once. I'd thought Hecha might make a deal in the end, but I wasn't expecting Myra and Mina to go through with it. From where I was sitting, I felt like they probably had less at stake, but I wasn't unhappy to be proved wrong. Going to my map display, the amount of information available to me increased drastically. For the most part, anyway. There were a weird pair of grey patches, but I wasn't put off since they weren't particularly large. I did pull a screen capture and write a couple of question marks next to them before putting them in my inventory. I'd put them up on my wall in my Palace of Shadows when I got back to it. I wasn't exactly forgetful, but this seemed like it would easily get lost in the shuffle if I didn't make a reminder for myself. Happy with the outcome, I started looking at the contracts again, just to make sure everything was how I expected it to be. Mina agreed to a more limited version of employment with me that was similar to Alim's deal. Mina's interest was fixed on finding a way home to her own world and her mother. It had been her goal in joining the Heroes Party before the Lily Pendant had been used to control her. Now she was determined to make up for lost time. Due to that, Mina was fine with buying things for me and sharing map data as she went along. What she wasn't interested in was agreeing to work on projects for me. Or rather, not in agreeing to do them without additional negotiations. If our interests aligned while she was searching, she'd consider accepting a commission. Myra was in a similar position. I got the distinct feeling she was doing it more for the chance to be able to have control over her class and other aspects of her build than anything else. Willing to work with me to an extent, but not to do as I bid without discussing the matter first. Unsurprisingly, they both got the basic features Alim did, but no payout in currency since they were more like freelancers than permanent employees. The only problem was that Hecha was looking at the temple I'd built as a potential cultural center where her people's traditions could be revived. My little passion project had suddenly blossomed into something much more important. Something it wasn't designed for, nor could it honestly support as it was. Still, that wasn't exactly a pressing issue. Her deal included the basics, but also my permission for her to bring refugees into the valley as settlers whom I wasn't allowed to force into the dungeon. Something I didn't have a problem with since I was more interested in them as a cover population than as point fodder. I was distracted enough by my reading I didn't realize that Stalin was yapping in the distance until I heard a proper howl ring out. Freaking out, I teleported to the den immediately. What happened? I demanded in a panic. My super useful brain generated worst-case scenarios for the entire split second I had before I was tackled to the ground. With 2 grown hounds smothering me, it took a moment for me to hear the more high-pitched noises mixed in with their own. Puppies. Blackmore yapped happily. Managing to wriggle halfway out of the pile, I was finally able to see the litter of pups that was happily gnawing on my tail. They were completely adorable, redder in color than their parents. The stone of their outer shell was thinner and looked almost soft. Like it was on the verge of melting. Ah! I exclaimed, reaching over to pet them. The little devils immediately started biting my hands and whining, but I didn't mind. I couldn't feel it, which was a blessing since puppy teeth fucking hurt. Chapter 112. New additions. I was deeply confused about how lively Blackmore was in the wake of the births, as well as how I'd outright missed them. I kind of remembered Aaron saying something about them, but I couldn't think of what and just rolled back through the security footage to try and figure it out. Or was trying to. "Buddy, come on, I need my face for stuff," I muttered. I had the puppies for the moment, since Blackmore and Stalin were taking a nap. 2 of said puppies were sleeping comfortably on my stomach while the third was busy trying to eat my hair and occasionally jerking my head violently in the process. It didn't hurt, but it was hella distracting. I heard a ding but no pop-up appeared. Buddy started floating above the puppy's head. I'd named him. Blackmore and Stalin both had already said it was fine if I did, but it still felt a little weird. Despite how many skeletons I'd named since I first met them, it felt like a task I was rather unqualified for. "Merha!" Buddy barked at me. I didn't know when the puppies would start talking, but it wasn't really a big deal to me. It would happen when it happened. Giving up on being productive for a couple minutes, I decided to deal with a pair of remaining issues. Namely naming the remaining 2 puppies. Rather than just decide on my own, I decided to let the rest of the dungeon denizens have a say. My regret was fairly immediate as I started to read the replies and had to fight down laughter again. Some of the options were reasonable but a lot of them were clearly the bastards trolling me. Annihilator of shoes. Piss machine. Dog 1 and 2. Scorcher of grass. Proof Stalin got laid. Bernie pup. Once I had proper control of myself, I pacified Buddy with a thorough round of petting and he finally joined his siblings for a nap. Free again, put the name issue aside and finally looked through the security footage uninterrupted. What I ended up seeing was not what I expected. I knew more or less what giving birth looked like. Not super specific details, but the broad strokes. What I ended up seeing wasn't even vaguely related. Rather than them exiting Blackmore's body through a traditional route, they kind of just appeared. An energy seemed to flow out of her and condense around several brighter points, which I assumed were the cores. I fought down a chuckle. If females of other species were aware of this, Blackmore would find herself the subject of a deep envy. Buddy stirred a little and I went as still as possible, not wanting the little tyrant to wake up so quickly. My interface chimed to let me know I had a message, but mercifully it wasn't in share mode so none of the pups woke up. "I want see pups." The message from Chris was the 5th one in 2 hours since he'd RESP'd. He wanted to be in the den, but it wasn't happening now that Blackmore was back to normal. Between her and the pups, he didn't last nearly long enough to do more than put in an appearance. I'd sent pictures already, but I knew what Chris really wanted was to be able to play with them. With nothing better to do for the moment, I started to dig through his settings. I'd done it before, but the system was weird. It was entirely possible I'd overlooked something or not properly understood it. When my initial search failed to turn up anything, I started looking through the skeleton settings. Still nothing, so it was time to dig around in the interface and look for stuff I might have missed or spawned out of the ether when I wasn't looking. I didn't find anything immediately useful and put looking harder on my to-do list. Wanting to find a workaround, I started looking through my shop and the items there contained. Elemental resistance potions were a thing, so I sent Chris one. "Chris, I'm not sure if this is sufficient but should at least let you be in the lava area longer. Give it a try. -42. Unsurprisingly, a reply didn't take long. Chris was not one to dilly-dally when he wanted something. "Can't drink it." I blinked as I took the attached video of Chris seeming to piss his pants as he drank from the bottle. Someone else had taken it and included the cursing fit that followed. I was so used to seeing him drink chaos that I'd kind of forgotten about the lack of soft tissue issue. Thinking about it though, when I was helping Elim, the potions had mixed just fine with cider. Once the puppies were awake again and returned to their parents, I took a break and headed for the Palace of Shadows. I didn't technically need to, but wanted to experiment in more hospitable conditions. Pouring a can of chaos into a bowl, I poured in the elemental resistance potion. As to what I expected to happen, I couldn't really say. Still, the contents turning into what looked like a small color-changing ocean wasn't on the list. I upsized the original bottle and poured the fluid in before putting it back in my inventory to give it a thorough look over. It came up as the same kind of potion it had been, but with a weird little symbol after the name. It also didn't stack in my inventory with others of the original type. To say I felt conflicted despite having made it was an understatement. I pointedly didn't send Chris a message about it. I felt like this was the kind of thing he'd be unable to resist, no matter how bad an idea it was. Like to the point where he'd figure out a way to get into my inventory, despite that not really being something he should be able to do. Making a responsible dungeon master decision, I sent it to Aaron for analysis instead. Mistress, I would like to understand your thought process for historical purposes. Why would you even do that in the first place? Did it seem like a good idea to you at the time? Have you considered checking yourself for demon possession when thoughts like make Chris fireproof occur to you? Thank you for your time. Aaron Eustace Ulner. Diak, I muttered as I read Aaron's reply. It wasn't like he didn't have a point, now that I was thinking about it, but still. Rude. Chapter 113. Something a little different. While occupied by the issue with the hounds, 42 hadn't exactly neglected the dungeon, but she had gotten behind on certain chores. Something she found herself unconcerned by, largely because she'd set the schedule for them herself. They were more for her comfort than anything else, after all, routine helped her function. Still, after making sure the new puppies seemed healthy, 42 made a point of doing rounds. She checked her layouts, popped into the various staff areas, and generally made her presence felt. Politely though, she didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. It was more of a social call than an inspection. Normally that kind of thing had mixed results. Most of the Bone Brigade were either disinterested in anything but the Raid League or standoffish when it came to 42 herself. They didn't like to ask for things unless they had to, and being necromantic constructs, they rarely needed anything. True to form though, the bards were an exception. Heading for the library, 42 found herself slowing down to take it in. Originally it had been a simple room with cut-in bookshelves. Now it was an entirely different beast, despite not having much of an inventory. Massive double stone doors led into a high-ceilinged sitting area. The furniture was a collaborative effort between 42 and Zalri Thistleblossom Clavicle. The halfling fighter was one of the few who'd elected to have her increase his ranks in the craft. Ranks he'd gotten from a half-finished apprenticeship. A thankful turn of events, as she only knew the general shape furniture could take, rather than how they were constructed. Now the space was full of low, comfortable chairs to sag into or high-back ones if someone were feeling fancy, as well as study desks and simpler chairs. Likewise, they'd worked together to create standing shelving for the floor as well. 42 had fussed over that in particular. Given the range of heights its potential users encompassed, she'd chosen to start hip-high to a halfling and stop at about 4 feet height. It was a comfortable range of browsing for most. Rather than have rolling step stools like those found back on her prior world, 42 had made the bottom section pull-out blocks for the halflings, in case they had trouble reaching something. Above, the arched ceiling had a complex series of vaults. 42 had been tempted to paint it and everything else like the Stiftsbibliothek Admont of Austria at first. It was well within her ability, even if it would take time. All of the designs had felt too heavy-handed in the end though. Instead, 42 had opted for something closer in aesthetic to the Brazilian Realgabine Português de Leitura. She'd elected to emphasize the wood and natural pink stone with carving and an occasional alteration to make a bit of it lighter or darker as suited the design. The books, when they had enough, would provide the actual color pop to make the design come alive. Said books being the issue which she was going to discuss as she found the pair who texted her to talk. 42 hoped the atmosphere would feel lively, but relaxed once it had more patrons. Thinking about the libraries in question, 42 could easily conjure up a number of others in her mind. The thoughts weren't terribly complete, maybe a few facts and images. As if she'd learned about them from a top 10 list rather than visited. Like a lot of glimpses into who she might have been, 42 had the distinct impression she'd been more of an informational magpie than any kind of scholar. Mistress, the library is in shambles. We have more books you've made than any other kind, Mirabella Fairburn humorous chided. She was one of the newer additions, a halfling bard. The fact that Tiberius Finley Radius, wizard, and possibly the closest person to a friend Aaron had, was backing Mirabella up was interesting. Not so much because 42 thought they didn't get along, but rather because she hadn't been aware he was interested in the library to such an extent. Aaron had almost nothing to do with it. Mirabella was 3 feet of determination and springs. Clad in bright yellow leather pants and tunic, she was also hard to miss. Like a half-goat sunbeam flitting about the library. She used the ladder rail on the outer wall shelving as a hand or foothold when she jumped to get something. The ladder itself was apparently too much of a bother. Her tail subbed in as a makeshift hand when needed for balance or grip. It's true, mistress, even if you added Aaron and my collections, we'd have less than 200 volumes of any merit, Tiberius added. It was an exaggeration, but not much of one. 42 had been making short books for Chris, and the only real issue with those was inspiration. Local texts, though, were harder to come by. Unlike Mirabella, Tiberius wasn't squaring up like he expected an argument. He had a more sedate personality that reminded 42 of a particularly patient university professor. His appearance also wasn't exactly incongruent with that feeling. Tiberius had been in his 80s when he died. When given the choice with his illusion of life, he'd opted to appear somewhere in his mid-40s, hair already salt and pepper. His clothes were a muted contrast to Mirabella's. He favored creams and navy with a wide-sleeved robe over his trouser and tunic. A little velvet hat finished off the ensemble and made him look a bit like a Venetian merchant as depicted in some art. Though Tiberius wasn't exactly what 42 thought of when she thought wizard, she kept that to herself. She had no idea what the aesthetics of his original world were like. He might have been on point for a wizard by those standards. Or the outfit was just comfortable. She made a mental note to work on her video game-informed expectations of class coding by appearance. It was silly and she knew it. Look, I swear I'm not being stingy, books are on the list of things for Elim to get. But he's only one guy and he hasn't been in places that had a lot, 42 offered, hands up placatingly. Elim had been adding entire shelves of books to the inventory when he got the chance. The trouble was that quite a lot of them were the same ones in different bindings or slightly different titles, but the same story. Be that as it may, something needs to be done, Mirabella said, every inch of her 3 feet ramrod straight. Yes, and I'll do it as soon as I think of what exactly that is, 42 said and sighed. Her tail was coiling and uncoiling to lash for a moment before going back to coiling. Something she only realized when she heard a rustling of papers. While she'd been preoccupied, it had knocked into some on the table behind her. Hopefully, soon I will have some new mortal employees, 42 added. How useful the girls would be for shopping was questionable, though she'd supplied similar terms on the point as Elim's. They wouldn't need to pay out of pocket, but whether they'd come across anything useful was uncertain. The women in the valley agreed. Tiberius asked, his surprise clear. Yeah, I could hardly believe it too, 42 replied. You have a private collection? Mirabella asked with a faint growl in her voice. Tiberius squirmed a little, clearly uncomfortable at the possibility of being made to share. I can make copies, 42 reminded the pair. It took more than simple literacy to make use of magic texts, so there wasn't any particular danger in having them in the general collection. If it were otherwise, she'd have had to seriously put some thought into how to keep Chris out of them. Thank you, mistress, Tiberius said with open relief. Thinking about Aaron and Tiberius's respective book collections, something occurred to 42. She pulled up an encyclopedia entry on Isolde, the Mage Kingdom. It seemed a relevant choice since that was where they were technically located. She converted the entry into a book and handed it to Mirabella. That's a pull from the system, so it's accurate, but not exactly a riveting read. Rather than just waiting on books, why don't we make some of our own? 42 offered. She had 16 bards to keep occupied, 8 humans, and 8 halflings. This seemed like something that would work when they weren't transcribing music and stories from their home worlds. Pardon? Mirabella said, clearly caught on the back foot. Think about you guys could take the factual stuff and make it less dry. I mean, it wouldn't be hard to set up a printing press if you wanted to start from scratch. Then you could illuminate the texts and add illustrations and I can just make system copies, 42 continued, warming up to the idea. All aspects of making a book were arts unto themselves, from binding, to cover making, and so on. What's a printing press? Mirabel and Tiberius asked together. Chapter 114. Inevitable Chaos. Chris didn't have much of a memory of when he was alive. At least not a particularly coherent one. Things would come and go in flashes of a variety of senses he didn't exactly have anymore. Taste and smell, for instance, were gone. Touch was a little iffy, but basically still there, and his sight was, if anything, improved. He'd have loved to be able to see perfectly in the dark when he was still properly fleshy. Things like the taste of a stolen loaf of bread, the bite of a knife in his flesh, and other memories tended to be a little fuzzy for Chris. Despite that, he could have said with senseless clarity what his mother Lula and father Ori's names were with absolute certainty. This despite never having known either, sold to a slaver before he could even recall who'd done the selling. Felice Keeg. The man who'd owned the brothel where his mother worked and died before he was a year old, had sold Chris. Like his parents' names, it was something he knew now in death he'd never known in life. Unlike his own name. That was a strange blank spot, and it had always been there, even when he'd been summoned other times. Normally Chris didn't care much one way or the other about his weirdly clear knowledge of his past or dodgy memories. Every once in a while though, something about it would start boring into his bones, demanding his attention. Not wanting to dwell on the matter, he was heading for Aaron's crypt cum lab. Not for a visit though, but rather because he'd noticed the other man in the library, which meant the normally well-guarded space would be his for the vandalizing. Christopher, Henry said, in his particular Henry way. The one that sounded mild, even friendly, but portended a savage ass-beating if Chris didn't abort whatever he was doing. How the ever-loving fuck the man managed to be shadow silent, despite his class change, was a mystery Chris dearly wanted the answer to. He did not enjoy anyone getting the drop on him, but especially not Henry. What? Chris demanded. Playing innocent was something he'd given up on long before he died, so he didn't bother with it in death. This isn't the way to your crypt, Henry said, leaning against the door of his own. They resided in separate halls and Chris's was in the opposite direction. And? Chris demanded. Henry didn't reply, arms still lightly crossed over his chest. As if it didn't matter if he needed to draw his sword anytime soon. Annoyingly, it probably wouldn't matter from what Chris knew of his speed. Half the bloody time they fought he never saw anything but the blue energy trailing after the damned thing. Generally after it had already cut him in half. Assassins were not built for direct conflict. 42 likes you, but you need to make a few friends in the NE necropolis too, since you can't settle on a trade or art. She can't drop everything she's doing every time you need entertainment, Henry said flatly. What? I'm not going to the palace. I'm gonna do Aaron a mischief. Chris retorted, entirely offended. Which will have him throwing a tea tantrum and her punishing you, Henry said easily. As if I'm the whore for her attention, Chris spat. Predictably, the venom failed to find purchase. Distressingly few things ever seemed to actually get to Henry in a meaningful way. Far fewer than the barbs the man managed to lodge in Chris's own mind. Really, what even happened? Normally you're skulking around her at all hours. She finally gets sick of you being a boring kiss ass. Another failure, Chris noted. Henry seemed amused if anything, which was the opposite of his intended effect. He'd thought it a sure bet, as Henry had obviously bollocksed up his courtship of 42 somehow. Too much a coward to defend yourself? Chris asked, trying to bait the other man. Henry actually laughed at that. Temper getting the better of him, Chris reached for a dagger, but he was surprised to find that Henry's hand was on the hilt of it, his eyes a bit brighter. Too old by half to flight with a foul-mouthed child because he's bored, Henry said. Chris bristled at that, but the hand on his dagger reminded him of why he normally avoided Henry. It wasn't fun to fight him, it was over too damned quickly and respawning was just a nuisance. Bastard, Chris growled. A truly toothless insult between them, from what he understood about Henry. By circumstance of birth rather than manners, or lack thereof, Henry said. He'd let go of Chris's dagger, recrossing his arms as if they were having a friendly chat. Looking Henry's outfit over, Chris was displeased to note it was one of the plain working ones. One of his few ways of getting back at Henry for anything was fucking up his clothes, the fancier the better. He typically only wore the nice ones around 42, which added a layer of difficulty. Well, fuck off. I'm just getting my Graveman book back from Egyde, Chris lied. Egyde Greenhand was a halfling who'd had the good sense to take the assassin class. Chris liked him well enough, but he was just the first person he could think of who lived in the direction he'd been headed. He never lent his books to anyone, though he didn't mind 42 putting copies in the library for others. At least of the less interesting ones. Some, like his Alphabet of Poisons book and Goodnight Moon, he liked having entirely to himself. See Chris, I respect you taking the tea time to learn to read, but you might try moving on to more enlightening works, Henry said, words having a hint of grumble to them. It took Chris a moment to place what could be the cause. He'd nearly forgotten how weird Henry could get about mentions of the Graveman. What a delightful thing for the man to so kindly remind him of. Right-o, Chris said. He flipped Henry the bird as 42 called, holding the middle finger aloft. One of many charming things she'd taught him, only to curse herself for in regret afterwards. He had no idea what sort of world she was from really, but going by how educated she was he felt she had to have been a noble lady of some kind. A world where a noble lady could teach all the most foul-mouthed of dock workers he knew a swear or two and it was normal, was a world he'd like to see. It sounded fun. By the time Chris managed to infiltrate Aaron's lab, he was in such a good mood his heart wasn't really in it anymore. The man was annoying, but he didn't go out of his way to be rude to Chris or even show his skull too often. After rifling through anything that looked interesting but not making much of a mess, Chris found a blank bit of wall to draw a 3-foot cock on in chalk. Looking at his own handiwork, Chris fussed with it a bit until he felt it conveyed the feeling he was going for. He followed that up by walking around and drawing other cocks all over Aaron's work, though only in the blank spots. Chris didn't understand any of what was written. He did, however, no obsession when he looked at it. Playful defacement would get Aaron mad, actually spoiling his work might land him with a proper curse on him. A turn of events even he wasn't interested in. One thing stood out, however. A set of neatly chalked symbols unlike the other writing. Chris wasn't sure, but thought they might be runes, the odd glyphs some people used to write with rather than more familiar letters. What made something a rune rather than a letter though, he had no idea. Instead of studying them, Chris turned away, already bored with his activity as his mind turned toward how to get back at Henry once more. On his way out though, something caught his eye. Sitting on a side table was a crystal bottle that looked like it would fit in Chris's palm. It sparkled a bit in the light of the magic stones lighting the room. Getting close enough to look at it properly, he found it was shaped like a kind of stylized wave. It was pretty, and the contents were a bright liquid in a kind of sparkling blue that cast a dappled light all around the bottle. It was probably a potion of some kind, but Chris didn't know anything about them. Curious, he picked the bottle up and tried to drink the contents. Normal liquids would just splash to the ground, but 42's magic chaos stuff in a can was something he could actually drink, and he enjoyed that. It stood to reason that he might be able to drink potions as well. Or some of them maybe, the elemental one she'd sent him hadn't worked out. Tipping the bottle back, Chris felt a slide of liquid similar to the feeling he'd experienced when he was alive. Whatever was in the bottle, he could drink it. Finishing it in one pull, he put it back on the table and waited a moment, wondering if anything would happen. Normally when he drank chaos, Chris just got to enjoy the feeling and a brief return of a sense of taste. It was nice enough, but it would have been fun for something to happen. A small eternity passed and the bottle refilled itself, but that was all. Odd, but not really of interest to him. "This place sucks donkey dick, let's go somewhere fun," a tiny blue lady made of water suggested. Chris looked at her, blinking slowly. She glowed a bit like the potion and was all of a foot tall. "Yeah, fuck this," Chris agreed and set off following the water woman. Chapter 115. Adjustments. Though I'd been in the lava area for a good while, I still felt reluctant about leaving. I didn't have a reason to remain holed up in the hound's den, though. Aside from puppy snuggles anyway. An entirely valid reason to hang out during my free time, but not for dodging work. With Blackmore doing fine and the puppies seemingly healthy, I looked at the pups and sighed. Buddy and his brother Pounce had been named mostly by accident. Pounce getting his because he'd decided death from above was the ideal tactic and was climbing on everything. Chris would probably approve, but he hadn't been around for a bit. If not for the fact he was probably sulking, I'd have been concerned about that. Chris going silent on me usually didn't end with "and nothing terrible happened" so much as mayhem. Holding the little girl above me, I looked into her magma-like eyes while she yapped happily. Unlike her brothers, she was a bit less physical, a big one for naps. She was also already showing a talent for manipulating heat. I hadn't realized it, but apparently fire hounds could cause existing fires to worsen. A pack of sufficient size could even cause a volcanic eruption. "I'm gonna have to offer to rename your brothers when they get older," I muttered. "They might take after their parents and not care, but I'd still offer." "Hestia, your name is Hestia," I said at last. "The Greek goddess of the hearth. Fire-related, but also a name associated with hospitality, which I hoped would inspire an even temperament. Not that I expected her to be any less murderous than her parents, but still. One could hope for a polite doom puppy. By late morning I was back in my palace of shadows, getting ready for an appointment. Andrea was due for a reset and class adjustment as per our agreement. It was also about time she started training, though I was still waiting on word from her potential trainer on that point. 42, Henry called. I gave a little start and looked over to find him dressed in what looked like sparring gear. A heavy quilted jacket in navy and black leather pants, all in a simple style. "Henry," I replied. More words should have followed, but they didn't. "You didn't ask that I come, but I thought it might be prudent to have a chevalier present to advise," Henry said, speaking a touch slower than I was accustomed to. "Definitely, I appreciate you coming," I said. We hadn't spoken in a while and I didn't know where he was at with everything. That didn't change how glad I was to see him. I had genuinely missed having him around. Before either of us could think of something more to say, there was a buzzing sort of noise heralding someone arriving by teleport pad. Andrea appeared a split second later, and not for the first time. I sincerely wished I could change the noise to a particular sci-fi one, but no luck on that score unfortunately. "Andrea, this is Henry. He's a chevalier and he'll be assisting today." "Henry, this is Andrea," I said quickly, wanting to get introductions out of the way. Andrea eyed him warily, but accepted Henry's shallow bow with one of her own. "If you find it agreeable, I'll also be training you," Henry added himself. I had to fight the urge to look over at him questioningly. I'd sent him the request when Andrea first signed her contract, but he hadn't agreed. Though it was entirely possible he hadn't made up his mind until today. "Okay, but aren't skeletons really weak? Andrea asked me. Without heroic class levels, certainly, Henry answered in amusement. Fortunately Mistress 42 has seen fit to allow us to have them. So I believe you'll find me adequate to the task of instructing you. Exactly, I agreed since I had nothing useful to add. Andrea looked at Henry dubiously but nodded. Let's start with resetting your levels. Do you want to be a chevalier again? I asked. I thought she would, class seemed like a big decision. Yet I didn't know when she'd made the decision or how she felt about it now. If it was a result of brainwashing rather than choice, I wouldn't blame her for picking a new one. Yes, I don't regret that. I'd wanted to be one before the pendant, even though I wasn't in my right mind when I made the choice, Andrea replied firmly. I flinched a little. She'd been under the influence of the pendant for a long time, but I refrained from asking for how long. I wanted to add that she could be reset again, but didn't. People were happier when they stuck to a first choice than if they were allowed to change their minds. I'd bring it up again if she struggled or was unhappy, but I wasn't going to undermine her choice now. Alright, so this is your stat window. You can make edits yourself now, though we're both happy to advise you, I offered. The window had manifested in front of her like the appearance selection for the skeletons did. I barely understand any of this, Andrea said after a few minutes. Make me as strong as you can, I don't care how. Andrea, we will, but you should learn how to do this. You'll need to manage it yourself in the future when you don't work for me, I said. Well, yes, but, for now, Andrea said, words coming out in a frustrated pout. I wanted to try and say something encouraging, but couldn't think of what. Henry put a reassuring hand on my arm, looking for permission for something. I nodded. Mistress 42 is correct, but it's alright if you just follow along for now, Henry offered. Andrea looked a little less tense after that, and he stepped forward to explain things and make suggestions. As an actual chevalier, Henry made most of the decisions about how to optimize Andrea's build. Where all three of us struggled was in assigning stat points. Agility was key, but intelligence and charisma could not be neglected any more than constitution. Unfortunately, Andrea's unmodified stats left something to be desired. I don't understand, is it because Andrea trailed off, looking downcast. She had penalties applied to her strength and constitution. No, Henry and I said together. I couldn't help an approving little shoulder nudge. I quickly moved through the tabs to find the heredity section. It looks like you've got a negative hereditary trait. A problem passed on in your family line, it's something most of your relatives likely have, I offered, pointing out the offending trait. Physical weakness. A hereditary condition that causes the recipient to suffer ill health and recover from injury more slowly than normal. Recovery of any kind is also made unusually difficult. It is twice as difficult as normal for them to gain physical strength and stamina due to this condition. And on the bright side, I can get rid of it, I added. Unlike a curse, these were not bestowed by the gods as some form of punishment. This apparently translated to them being considerably cheaper than blessings or removing curses. I paid for it, which brought up her constitution score to a normal level immediately. You would do that? Andrea asked in disbelief. I pointed at the screen since I already had. Why, she asked. You'll find that 42 is a great many things, but, stingy isn't one of them, Henry offered. It was the first time he'd tripped up on a word, and it confirmed my suspicion about why. He was actively working to suppress his stutter, rather than something having happened to remove it. Despite realizing it, I didn't say anything. It was something to discuss when we had a moment alone. For now, we had skills to deal with. So, I know you'll want to make sure your skills likewise enhance your class abilities, I began as we backtracked to that section. Since Andrea's intelligence dictated how many we'd had to finish her stats before messing with them. But I'd like you to consider using any excess to pick up a craft or other skill you might find enjoyable. All work and no play will make Andrea a dull girl, I added. The joke did not land, going by the flat look I got in reply. It's a quote, from where I'm from, I said. Let's move on. As you wish, Henry said. I could have sworn he was fighting down a smirk, despite having no face to speak of. Blessings next, I said aloud for no particular reason. It was the final tab and the only one we hadn't taken a look at yet. Opening the list up, I found she had a lot of options. 30 in all, from minor to major. The minor blessings were only 50 while the major ones were 100. My orbs flickered. This had to have something to do with either my alignment change or the server transfer. I'd bet points it was because of the transfer, mostly because I could now organize the entries. A drop-down let me sort them by power, alphabetically, and newest to oldest. It was one of countless other subtle changes that I'd been noticing as I used the interface. That there wasn't any kind of glaring difference made it almost invisible, but it was definitely richer in basic features now. This one, Henry said suddenly, pointing a finger at one of the options. Dark Spirit's Blessing, Greater. Having gained the blessing of those who dwell in shadows, the recipient is welcomed by darkness. They gain a number of new abilities and an affinity with shadow magic. All shadows offer them protection. So long as they fit within one, they are totally concealed. 3 times per day they may create a 10x 20 foot zone of darkness. 3 times per day they may move between one shadow large enough to conceal them and any other of sufficient size within their field of view. At will, they may extinguish any natural source of light aside from sunlight and dim magical ones. I stared at it for a few moments, taking in what it had to offer. It was an ideal blessing, for an assassin. Is that the one you want? I asked Andrea. I couldn't deny the utility of the abilities it offered. Nor was I honestly that put off by the assassin theming itself, so much as worried about the girl. Andrea was looking for revenge and this would be an excellent choice to help that goal along. Despite that, I didn't want Andrea to make a choice like this for only that reason. From what I'd seen, a person's class and abilities were part of them in a much more intrinsic sense than something mundane, like a job where I was from. Even if she was going to carve a bloody swath of murder through Stromhold, I didn't want her to build her identity around it. Definitely. Andrea said, looking entirely delighted. I managed to suppress a sigh, though it was a close thing. All right, it's a bit expensive. I'll be buying it later today. So look forward to that, I offered. Andrea nodded happily and took that as her cue to leave. She dashed for the teleport pad, leaving a streak of blue behind her as she activated a speed ability. You're worried about her, Henry offered. That obvious? I asked then chuckled. Henry just inclined his head. I feel like I'm going to regret this. She's anything but emotionally stable and I'm weaponizing her, I admitted. I didn't doubt she'd have gone down the same path, less efficiently, even if I refused. It just felt shitty to know I couldn't really do anything for her except hope that staying in the valley for a while would help her cool off and heal. Children are like cats with thumbs, Henry said. I gave him a bewildered look. You see her as a child, so accept that she'll bring you troubles just the same, he explained, laughing at my surprise. I guess, I said, reluctantly in agreement. I hadn't noticed it but at some point, we'd gone from standing next to each other to standing with our shoulders just touching. It was nice, but I didn't know what to do or say. I also didn't get any time to try and come up with something as I got a text out of the blue. One from Hecha, which meant I couldn't put it off. Speaking of cats, I hissed in annoyance. Chris, I take it, Henry said dryly. I just nodded, already in damage control mode. I also sent Henry a copy of the message, which had him sighing in exasperation as well. Mistress 42. Please do something about the naked madman in the lake. Regards. Hecha. A cat with thumbs indeed. Chapter 116. Fate. A village fete was both familiar and alien to Tiller. She'd seen plenty of them in various places, but she'd always been passing through. Being present for the entirety of one was surreal. Spending a fair part of it behind a tree holding Elim's hair back while he threw up was also strange. Not terribly unusual in the happening, but rather it was because of pie, rather than drink. Soldiering, she'd found herself seeing and assisting someone vomiting more than she'd seen combat. "You ought to drink that potion," Tiller said quietly, despite no one being nearby. The system had rendered up a bottle in the shape of a stomach and guts with green fluid in it. Elim had been unlucky and couldn't take advantage at the time. They'd been helping set up and he just bit back on the urge until he couldn't anymore. Sweet merciful Elim huffed when he finally got a moment between heaves to breathe. He downed the potion without further preamble. Tiller handed him a flask of water to rinse his mouth out with when he was done. After some spitting, he took a couple steps away from the mess he'd made to collapse. "Better?" Tiller asked. Elim just nodded, doing his best to just enjoy taking lungfuls rather than hasty snatches of air between bouts. Tiller sat on the grass beside him, amused but sympathetic enough to keep that to herself. Jessica had asked him to try an ungodly number of pie samples as she fussed with her recipe and the ones 42 had provided. Still, Erica hadn't complained when Tiller begged off once full. Something Elim probably would have caught on to if he wasn't chasing so desperately after his mother's forgiveness. She wondered if he'd figured out he already had it and his mother was just letting him run himself ragged until his own conscience was assuaged. Erica had told her in confidence that when someone wanted to make amends they apologized and asked the other party how. When you felt like shit and just wanted to not be in trouble though, you started flailing about for things to make it better. Elim tended toward the latter more than the former. A trait he'd inherited from his father and she, fortunately, found endearing. "Ugh, if I don't see a pie for a year, I won't miss it," Elim moaned, laying out on the grass fully. Laying with his eyes closed he was still for a few moments, a rather rare turn of events. Tiller was used to seeing him animated no matter what he was doing. "Especially apple?" Tiller asked sweetly. Elim reached up to give her a little shove in response. "Especially apple," Elim agreed with a moan. While Elim was indisposed, Tiller helped herself to the potion bottle. She couldn't say she cared much for the anatomical ones in particular, but they all had a kind of beauty. With the possibility of working for 42 and her continued association with Elim still firmly up in the air, she'd taken to collecting them. "So, what all happens at a fete?" "Can't say I've ever really been to one longer than it took to fill my belly," Tiller asked. Elim cracked an eye open at that, but shut it once again. "You spend most of the evening trying to balance getting just drunk enough to dance willingly with eating enough not to be hung over," Elim said and chuckled. "The game's just for kids then?" Tiller asked, honestly a little disappointed. Thinking of children, Tiller looked over to find Bess still glued to Erica. She had been all morning and didn't seem interested in anything but the contest. She'd helped with making the various entries, a first for her, so she was heavily invested in the outcome. "Depends on how attached to your dignity you are," Elim replied. "Me personally? I've yet to be bested at hoop darts and I intend to keep it that way." Elim went from laying on the ground to offering Tiller his hand up in a single fluid motion. She was caught off guard but accepted, pulled easily to her feet. It was odd seeing how differently he moved after his class had changed. She'd have called him agile before, but now she saw the odd shadow of gracefulness in it which contrasted strangely with his mischievous grin. Once the setup was done, Elim proved that he was serious about not being beaten at hoop darts. He was gracious to the village kids about it and helped them improve. The adults were left to salvage their pride as they could. It wasn't long, though, before Erica and Bess were hunting them down. Both looked a touch impatient, though it didn't have anything to do with Elim and Tiller themselves. "Weddings and pledges happen now, but they don't take long. We do it all at once every year since it's easier to have a priest come by when we've got a bunch," Erica explained. People were already heading for the other side of the open green. Blankets were laid out, and families with children who'd be pledging or having weddings have staked out spots. Everyone else moved more leisurely while they did their last-minute fussing about outfits. True to Erica's pronouncement, the ceremonies didn't take long. The pledges were all done at once with little fuss. Wrapping a cord around wrists and reciting a few lines wasn't exactly difficult, even for children. The weddings took a bit longer, but there were only 4 of them. Mostly there was a ceremonial exchange of goods, then the pair recited their preferred verses and it was done. Nobody objected or made a fuss, though Alid Holt's wedding seemed to have a few boys in the crowd hiding tears or glaring at her groom, Adir. Tiller meant to ask a question, but when she looked over at Aleem she found him looking at her and forgot what exactly it was. By the time she got her wits about her again, the weddings were over. There was a bit of shuffling, but not much. People had more or less already settled in where they intended to stay for the next leg of the festivities. It was finally time for the food contests. The feast itself was also getting underway and nothing had a particularly formal air to it. Everyone who'd entered just sat next to their entries to hand out samples. People who wanted to vote for them threw a colored stone in a cup. The colors corresponded to the category, like red for pies and blue for sweets. Aleem politely declined to try anything in the sweets category. Everyone just laughed when he went up and bluntly voted for his mother. Tiller herself made a bit more of a show out of it, actually eating the samples of the competition's offerings, though she wasn't much keener on sweets than Aleem at this point. Tiller found the pies all varied quite a bit in fillings but were generally good. Everyone knew what they were about, either inheriting recipes and tinkering a little or thoroughly testing a new idea before the fate arrived. Doris and Erica's pies were definitely the standouts. Doris made a kind of custard one while Jessica made an apple one. Both were good and Tiller had to wonder what she'd think had she gone into it blind rather than sick of pie. As it stood though, she liked Erica's better and voted for it fairly. While the votes were being counted, Tiller and Aleem both went to get drinks before coming back for the final announcement. In the end, only 10 votes didn't go directly to family members. Doris and Erica tied, not a first though more often than not Doris won. "You all right with this?" Tiller asked quietly. They all knew that Erica could have done any number of things to tip the contest in her favor. Despite that, she'd only looked at Doris's recipe to understand it better, then focused on refining her own in her own way. Aleem had supplied a few goods and tools, but nothing exceptionally fancy, at her request. "Definitely. She's got half a sack of sugar in that thing," Jessica said with a little smirk. Doris looked mildly upset at first but recovered. She'd come over to try a sample of Erica's pie once the results were announced. That had seemed to change her mind in the end. "Long as you're happy," Tiller said with a shrug. Aleem just looked at his mother with naked suspicion. Erica didn't deign to meet his gaze. "Though, to be fair, I might have made that ridiculous version 42 sent me the recipe for and left it in Doris's kitchen," Jessica finally offered. "She's probably going to drive herself mad trying to figure out how to make it," she added with a smirk. Tiller choked on her ale while Aleem started laughing so hard he couldn't breathe either. Chapter 117. Local Customs. After the pledges, weddings, and contests, the eating and drinking started properly. For the last hours of daylight, the games also continued with renewed fervor from the children. Bess joined in this time, with Tiller and Aleem following after her. Erica, on the other hand, was joining in with the village elders seated over by the drink kegs. As per their plan, Aleem had supplied a few barrels of cider, and Erica was taking up the duty of handing them out. Tiller and Aleem had both respectively offered, but she'd waved them off, saying it was nice to catch up with the adults while they looked after Bess. Bess, for her part, made a point of playing every single game and then doubled back to the one she liked best. That turned out to be a knockdown game where she aimed a ball on a string to pass by, then swing back and knock over a piece of wood. She wasn't great at it, but none of the other kids were either, and they all had fun with it. When proper darkness came on, everyone returned to their blankets to pack them up for the night. Newlyweds and children would be heading home soon, while the adults stayed out and made use of the feast tables rather than blankets. The dancing had also taken on a different tone as they moved from whatever patch of grass they fancied to around the crackling bonfires. After eating, Bess had shuffled around on the picnic blanket, already drowsy like most of the younger kids after a long day. She was wearing Erica's prize ribbon as a necklace, understanding the tie as her grandma winning first place, and was clearly disinterested in alternative ideas. Elim picked her up, carrying her over to a kind of communal children's nap area. It wasn't anything fancy, just a hay pile with a couple of quilts over it, but it did the job. "You're still thinking about making a deal," Erica said quietly. They were alone, but it still gave Tiller a start. While they'd been working on the dishes for the fete, Tiller had confided in Erica regarding her frustrations with Elim. "Won't be anyone's business but mine after he cuts me loose," Tiller replied sourly. She understood it was up to Elim to decide whose company he kept. It just stung. She'd enjoyed being around him and his family. It was genuinely the first time she'd simply been accepted, talent included, with few questions and no fear. "And if he doesn't?" Erica asked. Tiller looked at her questioningly, but couldn't read anything of use in the other woman's expression. "Then we'll have to talk about it," Tiller said after a moment. 42 had warned against making deals behind Elim's back. She'd also declined to make one with her already, so Tiller supposed the entire line of thought was academic. Not unlike the idea of staying, since Elim had already made it clear that wasn't going to happen. "Fair," Erica said and chuckled. Elim was taking his time, it seemed, but when Tiller looked back toward the kids, she didn't see him. He might have gone off to join in the feasting and heavier drinking that was starting up. Tiller swallowed reflexively. Being anonymous in a crowd was one thing, having people look at her curiously and want to talk was another. She'd be fine if Erica went with her, but the idea of heading over on her own was enough to make her sick to her stomach. "Ahem. Forgot my shawl at home. Be a dear and fold up the blanket while I get it," Erica asked. Tiller just nodded, not registering the request properly. She already had the blanket half folded when she realized the walk from the green to the house and back was nearly a half hour. She'd been ditched. "Tiller, everything all right?" Elim asked, causing her to start. "Fuck," Tiller hissed but then laughed. "My ma take off?" Elim asked, his tone betraying only mild amusement. "Yeah. What are the flowers for?" Tiller asked. He was carrying a crown and already wearing one. "Ah, well. You don't have to, but it means you ain't lookin', so to speak," Elim explained. A hint of embarrassment came through despite the dark. "Lookin' for what?" Tiller asked, doing her best to sound innocently confused. She accepted the crown though, and was barely able to make the flowers out, more or less, in the dim spillover from the bonfires. They were white with pinkish centers, though she had no idea what they were called. Flowers had never been of much interest to her. Well, to get hitched. Anyone caught out tonight gets married in the morning. Not that everyone who does gets caught, but wearing flowers means you're spoken for or not looking, Elim finished, barely getting through it. Tiller had already put on the crown, not interested in having the local boys trying to court her out of her britches. Don't imagine many of them would have been willing to try. "You've got a reputation for not taking kindly to anyone getting too close to the women around you," Tiller said, laughing. "Anyone I've scrapped with over a woman crossed the lady first. I just taught them some manners," Elim said with a chuckle. "Fair," Tiller said simply. "Shall we?" Elim asked, offering her an elbow. Tiller accepted, and was a bit surprised that they were heading more toward the bonfire and dancing rather than the food. It wasn't like she was hungry, but it was unexpected. "Wearing the same kind also, families usually do that," Elim added. "You about to tell me I'm like a sister to you?" Tiller asked archly. "Gods no. Aleem said quickly. Tiller was a bit surprised by the offense in it. She was glad they were closer to the bonfire so she could see his expression. She might have thought he was upset if she couldn't make out that he was embarrassed. "All right, only child, it is," Tiller said, holding her hands up in surrender. Aleem looked surprised, and then laughed, and the tension went out of the moment. Rather than say any more, he offered her his hand as they approached the outer edge of the ring of dancers. A little confused, she took it and found herself being pulled into the current of the pattern. Having no idea what she was doing, it took Tiller a few rounds to pick up on the steps. Until then, she was being dragged along by Aleem and the girl on her opposite side, rather than anything that could be called dancing. Neither one of them said a thing, but she could see a smile on Aleem's face that she was pretty sure was at her expense. Tiller had half a mind to just run out of the circle and go hide at the food tables when the music changed. She found herself being pulled suddenly in Aleem's direction and spun in a circle. Rather than a chain of dancers, this time, they paired off. "Hey there," Aleem said, laughing. He looked gleeful, and a bit younger than normal for it. Probably his actual age, rather than the more ambiguous aura of father he tended to give off. Tiller would have said something in reply, but was a little too busy catching her breath. The new dance was still fairly fast-paced, but not nearly as fast as the earlier one. "Doin' all right?" Aleem asked with concern. Tiller nodded, but he still steered them out of the flow of other dancers. "I'm fine, just not used to dancing," Tiller admitted. It had been a while since she'd had to do so much, even in the way of combat drills. The dancing had honestly felt more strenuous than the training scouts underwent. They were mostly focused on riding a horse well, after all. "'S all right. We can take a break if you want," Aleem offered. As Tiller considered the idea, she finally registered that Aleem still had an arm around her shoulders, just as he'd had when he'd led her out of the dancing. "For a minute, then I'll be good to go again," Tiller said. She'd honestly liked it, despite being terrible at it, and was reluctant to mingle. "All right. By the by, did my ma say why she was leaving earlier?" Aleem asked. "She said she was going home to get her shawl," Tiller replied. Aleem went still, then inexplicably started to blush. "What?" Tiller asked, confused. "Nothin', want a drink before we go again?" Aleem asked. Tiller nodded, and was relieved when he produced a cup seemingly from nowhere rather than them having to go to the feast to get something. While Tiller drank, Aleem did his best not to start laughing. He'd seen his mother walk by on her way to get Bess while he was getting flower crowns. She'd taken off for the house carrying his still sleeping daughter, the shawl she supposedly needed wrapped around the little girl. She wasn't even trying to be subtle this time. Chapter 118. Nothing to see here. Chris was high, and not just a little. Given his lack of soft tissues to inebriate, I wished that was the weird part. For want of a better description, Chris was sparkling, giving off light like a magical girl anime protagonist. Only predominantly in blue with undertones of green instead of the usual team leader pink. Water flowed around him in a complex swirl while he lounged in the middle of the floor of a new room I'd added to Aaron's lab to contain him. Chris insisted he could talk to the fish contained in said water, but I doubted it. Lake fish wouldn't have a reason to know lusty sailors' songs. Thankfully it kept him entertained, if nothing else. He hadn't even tried to escape the magic circle he was in. "So, you have no fucking idea what exactly is going on?" I asked Aaron. The skeleton in question had been running the magic equivalent of diagnostics on Chris more or less since I fished him out of the lake. Chris had thoroughly offended the eyes of Mina and Hecha before I got to him, but had done no other apparent damage besides causing minor flooding in the crypts. Whatever the hell had happened to Chris seemed to have granted him a slowly decaying ability to control water. He'd used it to make a pool, then lost interest in it before heading out to the lake. "Correct. Mistress," Aaron said hesitantly. I'd been freaking out more than a little since the incident occurred, but I was calmer now and realized I'd probably put him on edge. Hey, relax. I know this isn't your fault. You couldn't have known Chris was going to go through your shit like that, I offered. Chaos beverage plus a potion was the cause, and the result was pure WTF sauce. That wasn't on Aaron in the slightest, since I was the idiot who'd created the chimera concoction. I'd also handed it over to him for study without taking any anti-Chris precautions, which was also on me. I should have assumed Chris's chaos goblin sense would tingle, and fuckery would ensue. Thank you, mistress, Aaron said, relaxing just a little. Yeah. Try and figure out when it might stop if you can, I said after a moment. Nothing in Chris's stats explained what I saw, but the effect was wearing down. Once it stopped, it seemed like he might be okay, though I couldn't be sure of the side effects. Aside from his permanent immunity to fire damage, anyway. That had been added to his stats, unlike the light show. Part of me wanted to make sure Chris was okay before anything else. That part made a deal with the paranoid feeling he'd managed to make things worse and opened a security window to monitor him continuously. I cared, but I had shit to do. Also, unlike Blackmore, he wasn't in apparent danger and had brought the situation entirely on himself. With the issue as sorted as I was going to get it, I headed to my Palace of Shadows to make some calls. Andrea had changed her build, and it was the other ladies' turn. Something they all had stated they'd rather not do in the dungeon proper. From a technical standpoint, I knew I could have just gone to the farmhouse myself to facilitate the resets. It wasn't like sunlight burned me or anything. Honestly, the exposed feeling it gave me was the biggest issue. Nighttime was better, but I preferred being underground most of the time. Rather than worry about it for the moment, I made a video call. It connected with Myra almost immediately. I could see Roxolana, the fighter, and Grisey, the wizard, were already in the farmhouse. Roxolana would be advising Mina and Hecha. Grisey would try and help Myra. All right, aside from blessings and hereditary issues, you should be able to edit things how you like. I'll remain available if you have any questions, I explained. I'd given Roxolana and Grisey a crash course in character resets when I edited their builds after summoning them. They'd both volunteered when I sent a text around asking for help. Yes, mistress, Roxolana and Grisey said together. Sitting between Mina and Hecha, Roxolana was a calm but cheerful figure in her illusion of life. She was human, and her choice of clothes was an exciting blend to my eye. The cut was European in style but covered in simple geometric patterning and bold colors. The pattern reminded me a bit of Japanese sashiko, but it wasn't embroidered. Instead, it was accomplished through a method similar to batik. Roxolana had taken up dyeing as her personal craft and created the patterns using a resin that left white areas after the dye set. That group was chatting amiably while Roxolana explained their options. Grisey, by contrast, just looked confused. Myra's expression was a mask that didn't fill me with confidence about how they were doing. Something wrong? I asked. Mistress. I've reset her class, but I can't find a heroic equivalent, Grisey said after a moment. Does she still have the option to choose the original ones? I asked. Myra had 5 levels of Acolyte and 1 of Seer. I hadn't seen any options that fit when I looked through them while resetting the skeletons. Still, I'd been hoping there would be something. Preferably one that wouldn't fuck up her eyesight. Yes, Grisey said after a moment. Oh, thank you, Myra said, relaxing suddenly. If not for the stark change, I wouldn't have realized how tense she'd been before. That gave me a moment of pause. I hadn't considered that some classes might only be available if particular conditions were met. In fairness, that wasn't covered in the tutorial or the joke of a manual. So, you can pick your old class again, but if you're open to an experiment, why not pick Cleric for the first 5 and see if you can prestige to Seer? I can always reset your class again, I offered. I didn't know that 100% for a fact, but I'd double-checked and seen that I could reset Andrea again if she needed it. Since Myra hadn't lost access to Seer during the initial reset, it stood to reason she'd be fine. That should be fine. Some have been clerics in the past, but it's been a long time since the tower had enough resources to train them, Myra said after a long pause. Everyone around her had likewise stopped what they were doing before she answered. They all politely turned back to their own business after the good news. Good, good, I said for want of anything helpful or intelligent. That was when something occurred to me that should have earlier. Grisey, are you comfortable helping with cleric levels? Or should I ask for someone else to help advise with those? I asked. It would be best to get an actual cleric. I wasn't even religious before, Grisey said with a shrug. Myra, is that all right with you? I asked. It was Myra's build, so it was up to her. Yes, Myra said without any hesitation. I texted the clerics once I had permission. Neat. I'll have someone over shortly. Everything going all right for you guys? I asked. Roxolana and Hetcha nodded. Totes. This is way more fun when my brain isn't a horny disaster, Mina chirped. I started to reply, and then realized I had no idea what to say. On the bright side, Hetcha and Myra looked as wrong-footed as I felt. Oh. Dawn said she'll help, I said aloud to move the conversation forward. On the heels of that pronouncement, I teleported Dawn from her crypt to the farmhouse. She sat down with Grisey and Myra, getting straight to work with only a nod for me. While everyone else was occupied, I started looking through Myra's build. Thankfully she'd been able to become a seer despite swapping cleric for acolyte levels. Not having had a chance to look the class over, I took the opportunity. The write-up was pretty straightforward, like most of them were. The only thing I was having trouble with was finding the source of Myra's eyesight problems. Not because they shouldn't be happening, her vision would degrade with every level until she was blind. I couldn't place the severity given that she was only first level in the class. Myra. Did you get potions from the system and not take them? I asked after a few minutes. What? Myra asked, startled as I'd interrupted a discussion with Dawn. Once you signed with me, you got the health benefits. However, you have a condition that should have resulted in you getting a potion or two, but it's still in your stats, I explained. Myra had been exposed to a toxic substance. One whose most noticeable effect was blindness and mild physical paralysis. My confusion wasn't about the foreign substance but how oddly close to the natural degradation the class caused its symptoms. Well, I did, but I can't take it, Myra said. Why? I asked. I had a pretty good idea, but this wasn't something to make assumptions about. The vision healing potion? Hetcha inquired. I just nodded, and she looked uncomfortable but cast a supportive look her lover's way. Loss of vision is required to become more connected to Eula. I can't restore my vision without threatening that, Myra said. I nodded, expecting as much. Did you have to drink something or do a ritual to cause it? I asked. I got a pair of nods and couldn't help a sigh as I scrubbed a hand over my face. Myra had mentioned they hadn't had the resources to train clerics for a long time. Even before it fell, things must have gotten pretty bad in the Seer Tower. Well, not all of it is because of your class. That damage can't be undone. The potion will only fix what happened in excess, I explained. I wasn't technically lying, despite leaving some things out. The loss caused by her class specifically stated it couldn't be undone without entirely renouncing the class itself. And if I still refuse? Myra asked. Before she'd signed the contract, I'd have found that question worrying. Now I didn't have to weigh my every word with as much care. Then you don't take it, I said flatly. I thought it was unreasonable, but this wasn't just a question of utility. Myra was a seer that belonged to a religious order. This might fall under the nebulous issues of faith, and I wasn't about to argue that with her. I I'll consider it, Myra said after a moment. I just nodded. I doubted that I'd been religious in my prior existence. Something about it rang hollow even in a world where the gods were active and felt. Anything further, and I'd likely come across as cynical or petty. Particularly since I was pretty sure the Seer's Tower had thought they needed to cause the blindness and poisoned their acolytes. Religion was weird, and one of the few social landmines I could reliably identify. One I would not be tap dancing on this time. That was not how shadow monsters made friends and influenced people. Chapter 119. Hello again. 2 days after I'd handled the deals and class resets, I was outside Andrea's room in the hallway. I had her permission, but it took me a few moments to go inside. I'd made it in a hurry when I separated the girls a few days earlier. It was probably fine, but I'd asked to look at it and make some adjustments. Andrea had responded tepidly, as she did with anything not about training. Her one-track mind didn't have room in it for things like personal comfort. I was overthinking it a bit too, but she'd pricked my pride a bit when she'd said it was ridiculous in terms of size and amenities. It was silly, but I didn't want my capabilities judged by something I'd slapped together in under a minute. I would show the young lady precisely what was ridiculous in my domain. I also needed to kill some time, and this was a thing to do that didn't require much focus. I widened the room and bought exterior tiles along the face of the mountain outside. Then, shifting things around, I pushed the interior back and cut a gap. Into that, I placed a straight sheet of glass in a pitch-sealed channel for a vast window that ran the length of both chambers. I completed that with a glass door that now led outside to a terrace that overlooked the valley. The wall and window were set back enough that they wouldn't catch the light and give away the room's location to anyone below. It would also provide shade and help keep the interior from turning into an easy bake oven. Inside the newly expanded bedroom, the closet became a walk-in, and the bathroom got a tub Andrea could lie in. If what I'd made looked suspiciously like a modern apartment from my world, nobody would know enough to judge me but Mina. More important, though, was that Andrea wouldn't likely give a rat's ass about 90% of what I'd done. That left me with a creative itch. I wanted Andrea to like her place and feel it suited her needs. Of course, real comfort would have to come later when she was more willing to talk to me or interested in changing aspects of it herself. Still, to get the ball rolling, I added an empty chamber next to it on the interior side and connected it to the entry hallway. A personal training area wasn't something I'd promised Andrea, but I felt like she'd appreciate it. I played with the aesthetic for a bit, ensuring it was well lit and other detail work before calling it quits. A call I'd been expecting finally came in, and I steeled myself. Rather than take it in Andrea's room, I transferred to my palace of shadows. Henry was seated on the couch working on some embroidery, but he was easy to keep out of frame. We had plans to talk, but he'd insisted on waiting until everything with the girls was sorted out before we did. "We've reached our decisions," Hetcha said flatly. The Lepusan woman had elected to be a fighter focused on hand-to-hand combat. Her powerful legs were brutal enough in close quarters that things like swords and daggers wouldn't help much. So her backup weapon was a bow. I expanded the frame of the video call and took in the farm's dining room, which was cast in deep shadows as the girls sat around the table. They all looked reflective, which made me curious but didn't increase my anxiety. We'd made our deals, and while I had preferences about what they did next, I accepted that the decision was theirs. I've decided to explore the desert regions, basically anywhere in the opposite direction of Stromholt. I never want to see that fucking wretched hive of scum and villainy again, Mina pouted. She was probably trying to seem menacing, but it was like a hamster making a mean face. Sure, it could bite, but it still looked cute. Ha, fun use of the quote, I said appreciatively. What quote? Mina asked. You'll never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy than this? Star Wars. I paused, wondering if Mina was messing with me. When I decided she wasn't, I suddenly felt that she was more fundamentally alien to me than the monsters I lived with. We were franchise crossed, born of worlds alike in technology. Hers gifted with full dive VR. Mine, admittedly a bit behind, with the benefit of the awesomeness of laser swords. Okay, you'll explore the desert, I acknowledged. Part of me ached a little, but I got over it quickly. It was probably weird that we had much of anything in common in the first place. Beyond my deeply inconsequential disappointment, Mina's choice of direction benefited me. I had no map data in that direction. I hadn't intended to suggest anyone go that way despite that. Desert travel was hard, but it worked for me since she wanted to explore it for her own reasons. I take it you two are going right back into the jaws of the beast, I said to Myra and Hecha. We don't have much choice if we're going to free my people, Hecha said flatly. Though there's still the issue of the collars, we can't ask someone to die every time we need to take one off, Myra added. Wait, what? I asked, confused about who exactly had died and when. Unless I'd miscounted, all persons who'd entered the valley were accounted for. Unless they weren't talking about Hecha's collar, then all bets were off. I'm not sure how your minion did it, though. Everyone else who tried perished before they could open it, Myra explained. She misunderstood the depth of my confusion going by that answer. Still, the missing bit slid into place after a moment. Oh, well, the person was already dead when they took it off Hecha. One of my skeletons, Chris, did it, I explained. I didn't bother mentioning they'd seen him skinny dipping in the lake since then. Oh. That makes sense. Mina said brightly. The other girls looked at her with something like resigned acceptance laced with envy at her ability to still be cheerful. But it doesn't solve the problem since they can't leave the dungeon, Hecha said, though she glanced a bit mistrustful at me. As if worried some unspoken rule wouldn't apply to me, or I'd figure out a way to break it. I would have been flattered if I wasn't profoundly aware that I wasn't up to any such task. I'd caught a few breaks, but they weren't really exploits. They were, to my knowledge, existing features of the system. That's technically correct unless you want to make another deal. I gave Elim a monster as a guardian. It might be possible to assign a skeleton to work with you too, I offered. That. I think it might draw unwanted attention, Myra said, looking as if she thought I'd lost my mind. Oh, you'd be surprised. What did you think of Dawn, Chrissy, and Roxolana? I asked, feeling a little mischievous. I thought they were really nice. Mina offered. This got her another round of looks. I quickly texted Dawn. What do they have to do with skeletons? Andrea asked. Well. I trailed off for dramatic effect. I teleported Dawn in and shifted my position so she entered the video call's frame. You've met Dawn already, but I think you haven't really gotten to know her yet, I said, unable to stop a grin. Dawn obligingly bowed, then deactivated her illusion of life as she rose up. A chorus of shrieks rang out as she stood before them as little more than bones with golden glowing jewels for eyes. Chapter 120. Community Planning. The valley, which I needed to name, looked like it was holding an undead festival. Myra, Hecha, and Mina were all topside exploring the small main street I'd set up during the week since I'd revealed the skeletons to them. There were 10 buildings in total, and I had a sketch of what the space would look like as I filled it in going forward. One I was presently in the process of editing the shit out of. My little Halloween town was a project I'd been working on without much input, which showed. It also turned out I'd phrased my former requests for input too confusingly or ambiguous, depending on who you asked. Now the Bone Brigade properly understood it would be topside, and they could apply to live in it and eventually interact with mortals. That resulted in a flood of requests and ideas. Certainly, some of them were misguided suggestions for discreet murder, oddly not from Chris, but the enthusiasm was appreciated regardless. It had taken a couple of days for the girls to get comfortable with the skeletons. I'd told the Bone Brigade to carry on like usual with their illusions. While the girls were important to my plans, such as they were, that was no reason to force my residents to do anything uncomfortable. They took a couple of days to loosen up around the girls too, but now mingled relatively freely. Thanks to the change, I was overwhelmed with artistic work, which was glorious. The would-be shopkeepers and merely curious mingled to exchange notes and ideas. I was flooded with design modification requests, placement change suggestions, everything under the sun. I was having fun watching the proceedings from my palace of shadows. While the girls were exploring, I had a scheduled meeting with the halflings who wanted to move into the town. They'd been the most vocal group by far, so once the example main street was done, I'd decided to prioritize them. I had a representative party of halflings on their way to meet me. Honestly, being out and in the daylight made me deeply uncomfortable. Still, irrationally anxious or not, I needed to be outside to do the implementation phase correctly. "Mistress!" Icarus called. He was leading the pack of halflings coming into the Palace of Shadows. I waved and waited for them to form up on me before teleporting us all to the area that had been selected. Of course, I could have done it individually, regardless of where they were. Only it felt like that was a little weird. Meeting up and going felt more natural than just snatching them from wherever they happened to be. It's lovely," someone said as the group started murmuring. About a quarter of them had illusions of life, so they spoke aloud instead of the usual silent telepathy. Strolling along the path, they started checking out the interiors of the test houses. Despite it being a bit cowardly, I was hanging back in a stand of trees that cast deep shadows. It wasn't perfect, but it helped ease my nerves just a bit. I watched the halflings explore the test units from the shade of the trees. They looked pleased enough, but I felt like something was off. The halfling warren in the dungeon had a low entrance, so I'd initially designed their homes with their heights in mind. The shops were taller to accommodate other races, with doors that split in the middle. It looked funky to me and not in a charming way now that I was watching them use the spaces. "Hey, Mirabella! Is this similar to the place you lived before?" I asked. Mirabella Fairburn, humorous, bard librarian, was the nearest halfling to me and studied the buildings curiously. "Well, sort of. Plenty of us had shops along roads and the like, but our homes were usually cut into embankments of rivers," not Mirabella gestured. "I'd essentially made mountains and set the housing into them. That clearly didn't match how they'd done things, and it wasn't aesthetically pleasing to my orbs now that I was looking at it. Anyone object to me changing things up?" I called out. A chorus of no came back after only a slight pause. Laughing, I cracked my knuckles and opened my interface to try something a bit more extreme in terms of renovations. Multi-selecting tiles, I included the river and 20 feet on either side to act as a flood plain. Thankfully, the lake was already lower, so I didn't need to mess with that. Next, I depressed the tile group by 8 feet, which created a new set of cliffs. "Phew-uck," Icarus said appreciatively. The other halflings let out similar exclamations or whistled. I made a little bow, the butterflies in my stomach abating just a bit at the praise. I wasn't done yet, though. I pushed the cliffs out and infilled to create a gentle slope adorned with thick grass to keep the dirt in place. I felt it looked nice and wouldn't trap anyone who might accidentally slide down. Coming 4 feet up from the river plain, I cut a wide, for halflings, path into the slope. I covered it with bricks of the valley's natural stone. Next, I adjusted the slope above to make it even gentler than the lower one. With the basic preparations complete, I moved the houses I'd made originally into this new section. I kept the entrances on the interior, so they faced the river. The doors were in little cutouts with roofs above them, so they were easy to find and didn't stick out into the path. The idea of having to step directly into foot traffic from your front door was gross to me. "That's much nicer," Rialis Old Buck humorous said, then laughed. He and the rest of the halflings walked into the new arrangement while I contemplated an issue. The houses were now sticking up about 2 feet above the slope. I considered covering it up with more dirt and grass but hesitated. I could have waited but decided to test an idea. I copied a home to experiment with. I added enough earth to make a new mound on top of it, but this one was only 3 feet high. Playing around with some internal structure changes, I got it to a point where I felt comfortable placing one of the shop designs on top. Rather than leaving it tall folk friendly, I cut it down to halfling preference in height but added a large window so goods could be displayed. Next to it, I added a smaller to-go style window. Since it was on a raised mound, the store was at a comfortable height for taller folk to look into but not comically oversized for their intended owners. Mistress 42. Hecha inquired. I nearly jumped out of my pseudo-flesh. I was halfway over the roof of the shop I was working on before I even consciously processed who'd spoken. I hadn't heard her approaching and she'd come from behind me, where no one was supposed to be. Yes? I asked. I knew I probably looked as much like an idiot as I felt as I peered over the store's roof at her. With my dignity in absolute tatters, I couldn't do much but proceed and hope Hecha indulged me by just going with it. Fortunately, she didn't seem to react much to my little stunt. Can you make burrows like you made whatever these homes are? My people prefer living underground when we have a choice, Hecha asked. We call them warrens, Mirabella chimed in from my left. She was sitting with a grin on the roof next to me. If I had the required anatomy, I'd have pissed myself because I hadn't heard her climb up. I felt I might need to make bells into a fashion trend if I wanted whatever my heart equivalent was to hold out long term. I think my people call them that when they reach a certain size, though I'm not sure, Hecha supplied. From what little she'd said about herself, she hadn't grown up in a Lepusan community. Unfortunately, I hadn't been able to find much in the way of cultural or historical information on them either. Lepusan history was only covered in broad strokes by the encyclopedia. Moreover, they had been in a diaspora situation for quite a while. So cultural erosion wasn't strange given those circumstances. I have no problem making something like that. If what I come up with doesn't work, I can always alter them later, I offered. Of course, it might get tricky to do anything significant once mortals officially lived in the valley, but I'd think of something. Though. Would you prefer this environment, or would a forest be better? I asked out of curiosity. I associate rabbits with open grassy meadows, but Lepusan weren't rabbits. So I didn't honestly know what they might like. You'd change the valley into a forest? Hecha asked, looking stunned. I could, but I was asking because I have some land in a natural forest on the other side of the mountain, I explained. I wasn't that into the idea of outright changing the local environment. Despite how much I tinkered with it, I'd never outright used foreign plants or altered the biome type. Want to take a look? I asked. I'd been buying tiles on that side occasionally, which was why I'd held off on adding elves to the dungeon. They weren't represented in the typical local species, so I didn't see a reason to rush. They'd probably be happier if they had access to a lovely outdoor area right off rather than having to wait. You can just cross the mountain range here? Hecha asked, sounding worried. Problem? I inquired. I didn't have much information on the other side of the range, but it didn't seem strange or dangerous. Hecha started to say something, then paused, looking up at the mountains. I suppose that depends on how well you get along with demons, Hecha said finally. Get along with what now? I asked, taken aback. Then what she meant sunk in. Ah fuck. If you want to be knee-deep in blood, guts, and glory, we do have a few lesser opportunities. Demon Lord is particularly popular, Steve had said during my interview. Somehow I'd forgotten about that. If Demon Lords were a thing, it stood to reason that demons would be. I might have fucked up with the second entrance.